Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. Story 1. The Silent Scriptorium, How Monks Preserved Knowledge in Boredom. The life of a medieval monk was often imagined as serene, a quiet cell, soft chants, and the gentle scratch of quill on parchment. But if you were a monk in the 12th or 13th century, your day began before dawn, not with sunlight or birdsong, but with the harsh ringing of the monastery bell. By the time your feet touched the cold stone floor of your cell, the cloistered corridors were already filled with the muffled footsteps of others like you, moving through a rhythm that had remained almost unchanged for centuries. You were not here for comfort or for glory. You were here to serve, to obey, and most importantly, to preserve knowledge. The act of copying texts, what we now romanticize as a quiet devotion to learning, was in fact a laborious, monotonous, and often grueling process. Scribes, as they were called, spent hours hunched over wooden desks, their eyes straining against flickering candlelight, their hands stiff from cold and ink. Mistakes were not trivial. A miswritten letter could alter scripture or law, a single misstep capable of distorting the spiritual and legal foundations of the world outside the monastery walls. Monasteries were the intellectual strongholds of the medieval world. When most of Europe was embroiled in war, famine, or plague, monks quietly transcribed the works of Aristotle, the Bible, legal codices, and even texts on medicine and astronomy. You might expect that this task was revered, even celebrated, but in reality it was tedious, exhausting, and relentless. One manuscript could take months or years to complete. The scriptorium, the room devoted entirely to writing, was both a sanctuary and a prison. You would sit shoulder to shoulder with fellow scribes, each at a slanted wooden desk, quills poised, the only sound being the scratching of nibs and the occasional cough or whispered prayer. The air was thick with the scent of ink, tallow from candles, and the mustiness of parchment. If you leaned back too quickly, you risked spilling your ink, a disaster not easily remedied. Some monasteries even employed correction monks, whose sole job was to carefully check each line against the original, ensuring no error survived. The smallest deviation could bring shame, or worse, spiritual consequences, as your task was considered a form of devotion. But why go through such extreme measures for mere words on parchment? Knowledge in medieval society was power, though rarely power in the worldly sense. Knowledge preserved civilization. Without scribes, the works of ancient philosophers, the laws that governed kingdoms, and the wisdom of physicians would have been lost to time. And yet, the act of preserving this knowledge was almost entirely invisible to the outside world. Kings and peasants alike benefited from it, though few knew the faces behind the manuscripts. Your contribution was quiet, anonymous, yet indispensable. Some monasteries became famous for their productivity and precision. The Abbey of St. Gall in present-day Switzerland, for instance, had a scriptorium that meticulously copied texts from the Bible to commentaries on law. The monks there adhered strictly to the rule of St. Benedict, which dictated not only prayer and labor, but also attention to detail. You, as a monk, might work from dawn until mid-morning in the scriptorium, then pause for prayers, followed by more writing in the afternoon. Even meals were often silent, consumed in the company of others without conversation, reinforcing the meditative yet monotonous life you led. Yet this life of repetition did not prevent creativity. The monks developed intricate methods to make their work legible, beautiful, and, in some cases, even symbolic. Illuminated initials, delicate illustrations, and gold leaf were more than decoration, they were teaching tools, conveying spiritual and intellectual meaning. You might spend hours just on one letter, ensuring that the curves, the dots, and the shadows were perfect. And while some modern readers may see this as artistic, for you, it was a spiritual duty, a way to honor the text you were entrusted with. Despite this devotion, not all monks were naturally suited to such painstaking work. Eyes would water, backs would ache, and fingers would cramp. Some fell into dangerous habits, eating poorly, neglecting sleep, and overstraining their bodies. Illness was common, and yet, in these moments of human frailty, the weight of responsibility never lifted. You understood that every word you wrote was a link in a chain connecting generations of knowledge, a bridge between the wisdom of the past and the uncertain future. Outside the monastery walls, the world was messy, unpredictable, and often violent. In that sense, the scriptorium was a refuge, a place of control and order. But the isolation came at a psychological cost. The quiet that allowed for focus could also amplify loneliness, doubt, and the creeping thought that perhaps your life would be entirely consumed by repetition. Few understood this internal struggle, and fewer still wrote about it. The details of boredom, of the slow erosion of time, were not recorded because they seemed mundane. But this mundanity was, in truth, the engine of civilization. Every painstaking copy preserved life-saving medical knowledge, sacred texts, and the foundations of law and philosophy. And yet, not every text survived. Fires, floods, and neglect destroyed countless manuscripts. Sometimes, even careful scribes introduced errors unintentionally. How could you reconcile your devotion with the fragility of your work? Was the effort itself a form of worship, or did the impermanence of ink and parchment make your labor almost meaningless? As you sit in the scriptorium, quill in hand, staring at the blank space on the parchment, you might wonder, what would the world lose if even one of these monks stopped writing tomorrow? How much knowledge had already slipped into oblivion, lost to the damp stone walls of forgotten monasteries? The work was tedious, yes, but in its quiet repetition lay a profound responsibility: to preserve humanity's fragile memory against time's inevitable erosion. And then, as you prepare to dip your quill once more into the ink, you might catch a glimpse of a shadow passing the doorway, a fellow monk perhaps, or something else entirely. You pause, feeling a subtle chill. How much of the silence around you is merely absence, and how much is hiding something you have yet to understand? The scriptorium, for all its discipline and order, holds more than just ink and parchment. It holds secrets, and those secrets are only beginning to reveal themselves. By the time the afternoon prayers ended, the scriptorium would feel almost like a different world. The lights shifted, flickering through narrow windows, casting elongated shadows across desks, benches, and the sloping, ink-stained floors. You, like the other monks, had likely been at your work for hours without pause, tracing the familiar lines of Latin, Old French, or Greek letters across smooth parchment. Each word required a deliberate, exact motion, the quill dancing in rhythm with centuries of disciplined tradition. But as the day stretched on, even the most focused monk could feel a creeping tension. There were moments when fatigue collided with concentration, when the quill trembled, and the letters on the page betrayed you with wobbled curves and blotches. You might think that these scribes spent their days in serene devotion, but the reality was far more complex. The scriptorium, for all its silence, was a place of intense pressure. Monks were expected to produce not only accuracy but elegance, and failure could bring subtle, sometimes severe consequences. A miscopied passage in scripture or a medical treatise could mislead generations. The responsibility weighed heavily on each monk's conscience, fostering a mix of humility, fear, and obsessive diligence. Some monks would whisper that the spirits of the authors themselves hovered over the pages, watching their work. Whether superstition or caution, it only intensified the monotony with an undercurrent of unease. Yet within the seemingly endless routine, small acts of ingenuity appeared. Some monks developed personal shorthand to speed their work or added marginalia, tiny notes, or drawings in the corners of manuscripts that would survive centuries and puzzle historians. You might have seen these: a faint doodle of a mythical creature in the corner of a psalter, or an almost imperceptible note correcting a previously miscopied word. These hidden marks were glimpses of personality in a world defined by uniformity and obedience. And yet, even these minor acts of creativity were not always harmless. Certain scribes were reprimanded for drawing frivolous images instead of focusing on the sacred text. The tension between discipline and self-expression threaded through the daily work like a quiet undercurrent. You also began to notice patterns of hierarchy within the scriptorium itself. Senior scribes would inspect the manuscripts of younger monks, sometimes for hours at a stretch. Their judgments could be subtle, a sigh of disappointment, a brief frown, a corrected letter, but these signals were enough to instill both motivation and fear. The meticulous review process emphasized that your labor was not merely for personal salvation. It was for the continuity of knowledge, the preservation of culture, and the spiritual welfare of countless souls. Every stroke of your quill was a tiny but essential link in an enormous, fragile chain stretching back to antiquity. Outside the scriptorium, monastery life had its own rituals, equally structured and precise. Meals were eaten in silence, interspersed with brief readings from scripture. Sleep was tightly regulated. The rule of Saint Benedict prescribed night vigils, long stretches of prayer, and strict schedules that left little room for comfort. You, if you were honest, might have struggled to find a private moment to breathe, to reflect, to feel anything beyond duty. And yet, this monotony cultivated skills that the world outside rarely recognized. Your ability to focus, to endure discomfort, to persist in tasks without external reward, was a survival skill in a medieval society defined by scarcity, disease, and the constant threat of violence. And there were risks you could not always control. Parchment and ink were valuable but volatile. Candles, essential for illumination, were a constant hazard. A single careless flame could consume months of work in minutes. You learned to respect fire as both a tool and a threat. Even disease crept silently into the monastery. You might witness colleagues succumbing to infections that began with minor scratches or spoiled food, and yet the work had to continue. The scriptorium, like the monastery itself, demanded endurance, physical, mental, and spiritual. Some monks found ways to subvert the monotony, sometimes in ways that were frowned upon. Certain texts were hidden, read in secret, or copied with personal annotations that revealed doubts, curiosities, or forbidden knowledge. You might discover a treatise on herbs with instructions to make tinctures, some medicinal, others potentially lethal, or an astronomical text that challenged the conventional understanding of the heavens, quietly suggesting that the earth was not the center of everything. These were dangerous acts. Knowledge, after all, was power, and power outside the bounds of monastic approval could be interpreted as heresy. Still, the scriptorium was not devoid of camaraderie. Shared exhaustion and purpose fostered quiet bonds. You would exchange brief glances, a wordless acknowledgement of shared endurance. These small moments were rare reprieves, fleeting but vital. Yet, even in these glimpses of connection, an unspoken tension lingered. Monks were expected to be obedient, devoted, and humble, but ambition, curiosity, and even boredom could lead to conflict or secrecy. The line between devotion and self-interest was delicate, and crossing it could have spiritual and worldly consequences. As months turned into years, the monotony shaped you as much as the texts themselves. Your hands became steady, your eyes sharp, your mind attuned to the rhythm of letters and parchment. You began to understand the subtle artistry in uniformity, the discipline in repetition, the power of endurance. Every copied line became a meditation on patience, mortality, and responsibility. And yet, you could not shake the sense that the scriptorium held hidden layers beyond what you had been taught. Some monks whispered of secret manuscripts tucked away in locked chests, containing knowledge so dangerous it could unsettle kingdoms or undermine faith. Others claimed that certain letters, words, or symbols had hidden meanings, invisible to the untrained eye. And so, as you laid down your quill at dusk, weary from a day of labor, you might find yourself staring at the carefully stacked manuscripts, pondering what lay between the lines. How much of history was faithfully preserved, and how much had already been lost or altered by human error or deliberate choice? And in a monastery built on obedience and silence, how could you, one lone monk, navigate the delicate balance between devotion, curiosity, and the dangerous allure of forbidden knowledge. In that quiet room, with only the fading light and the faint scent of ink and parchment, you realized that the scriptorium was not merely a place of work. It was a crucible, shaping minds, spirits, and destinies in ways the world outside would never see. And perhaps, hidden somewhere among the neatly aligned manuscripts, lay secrets that even the monks themselves had yet to understand. Questions began to form. Could the pursuit of knowledge ever be fully safe in a world so defined by obedience and fear? And if you uncovered something truly forbidden, how far would you go to preserve it or protect yourself from it? Night had fallen over the monastery, yet the scriptorium remained alive with quiet motion. Only a few monks still worked, their faces illuminated by trembling candlelight, shadows dancing across the parchment-strewn desks. The long day of copying texts had left you exhausted, yet there was an unspoken pull and insistence that the work must continue. Each manuscript carried not just letters, but centuries of wisdom, beliefs, and warnings that could vanish in an instant if neglected. In this silence, small discoveries began to surface. Perhaps you noticed that a colleague had annotated a line differently than the source manuscript suggested. Perhaps a tiny doodle in the margin hinted at skepticism, humor, or dissent. These small deviations were innocent in appearance, but within the monastery, even minor departures from approved texts could provoke scrutiny or suspicion. Monks spent years navigating this tension, the desire to understand and explore balanced against the imperative of obedience and caution. One evening, a hidden manuscript came into your hands, a collection of notes on herbal medicine, astrology, and moral philosophy. Its origin was unclear. Some whispered it was from a monk expelled decades before. Others suggested it had been smuggled in from a distant abbey. Its contents were fascinating and dangerous. There were remedies that could heal or harm, astronomical theories that contradicted accepted doctrine, and moral observations that questioned the rigidity of monastic rules. Holding it, you realized the weight of responsibility. A single misstep in interpretation could have far-reaching consequences. As you read, shadows seemed to gather at the edges of the room. Monks, often unobservant in the daytime, were suddenly aware of subtle glances, quiet movements, and the possibility of being watched. Monastic life had long conditioned you to focus on repetition, yet curiosity was a dangerous companion. What would you do with the knowledge you had uncovered? Could it be shared safely, or would it be buried in silence, hidden among countless other manuscripts, waiting for history to rediscover it centuries later? The physical act of copying had been only the beginning. The intellectual labor, the careful thinking required to ensure that every line maintained accuracy, was accompanied by an unspoken ethical burden. You knew that errors could persist for generations, that misinterpretations, however accidental, might guide rulers, healers, or clergy incorrectly. The scriptorium was thus a place where human frailty intersected with divine responsibility. You, the monk, were simultaneously a preserver and a potential threat, depending entirely on your vigilance, discipline, and judgment. But there were darker risks than mere errors. Some manuscripts, intentionally or not, recorded practices that could be considered heretical. Alchemical instructions, obscure rituals, and unorthodox interpretations of scripture circulated quietly in cloisters, often only accessible to the most curious or rebellious monks. If discovered, these writings could provoke scandal, punishment, or even excommunication. The very act of knowledge-seeking became a subtle form of rebellion against a system that prized obedience above inquiry. In the quiet of the scriptorium, you reflected on the broader implications. Every text preserved here was a triumph of human persistence, a testament to the resilience of knowledge against the decay of time, war, and neglect. Yet, the human cost was enormous. Eyes strained, backs ached, and countless monks succumbed to illness or exhaustion, all in the service of a cause invisible to the outside world. Their labor was both heroic and almost absurdly meticulous, a paradox that defined monastic scholarship throughout the Middle Ages. By the early hours of dawn, you realized that your perception of the scriptorium had changed. It was no longer merely a room filled with desks and parchment. It was a repository of human ambition, curiosity, and endurance. It contained hope, fear, creativity, and obedience in equal measure. The manuscripts, stacked neatly yet fragilely, were silent witnesses to the lives and choices of the monks who had labored over them. Some would be remembered, many forgotten, yet all contributed to the invisible backbone of civilization. As sunlight began to seep through narrow windows, illuminating dust motes dancing above the desks, you felt the weight of continuity. The world beyond the monastery would never know your name or your sweat, yet without your work, countless pieces of human knowledge, philosophy, medicine, law, and scripture might have disappeared entirely. And perhaps that was the ultimate lesson, that ordinary, repetitive labor, sustained over decades, had the power to shape history in ways few could imagine. Even so, questions lingered. Among the preserved texts, which knowledge was safe, which dangerous, and which had been altered, deliberately or not, to protect or deceive? And more personally, how much curiosity could a monk safely harbor before devotion became disobedience or insight became heresy? As you placed your quill down and prepared for the day's prayers, the scriptorium seemed almost alive, humming with the echoes of countless monks who had passed through before you. You wondered which secrets would remain hidden forever, and which might one day resurface to challenge assumptions, illuminate forgotten truths, or even rewrite history itself. The work of a single monk in a silent room might seem inconsequential, but in the grand scope of human civilization, it was nothing less than monumental. And so, with a final glance at the manuscripts, you stepped back into the cloistered corridors, carrying with you not only ink and parchment, but the heavy, quiet knowledge that the preservation of history is both a blessing and a burden. You could only hope that those who came after would honor the labor, understand the responsibility, and perhaps uncover the secrets that lay between the lines. Reflection. The scriptorium was more than a workspace. It was a crucible of patience, devotion, and human resilience. Through repetitive labor and disciplined monotony, medieval monks preserved the intellectual backbone of Europe. Their quiet sacrifices remind us that much of history is shaped not by dramatic events, but by the unnoticed, meticulous work of ordinary individuals. Story 2. The Candle Maker's Curse, Fasting Flames and Filthy Hands. In the dimly lit corners of a medieval monastery, long before dawn had a chance to creep over the horizon, you would find the candle workshop alive with activity. Or perhaps alive is too generous a term. Haunted or relentless might be more accurate. The monks who labored here were among the least celebrated yet most crucial in maintaining monastic life. Without their work, the church services, the nocturnal vigils, and even the scriptorium's meticulous copying of manuscripts would grind to a halt. Every flickering candle in the cloister depended on their hands, cold, stiff, and frequently coated in sticky beeswax. You, if you were among them, would begin your day before the first bell, working alongside fellow monks who shared the same weary rhythm. The first step in candle making involved melting wax in large, iron cauldrons. The wax itself was precious beeswax gathered painstakingly from hives that monks tended to in carefully concealed gardens or purchased at great expense from local villages. The process required constant vigilance. Too little heat, and the wax refused to flow. Too much, and it could ignite, sending flames crackling dangerously close to wooden beams and parchment, a fire hazard that haunted every workshop. As you dipped wicks repeatedly into the molten wax, layering them to the desired thickness, your hands stiffened and blackened from soot, and a faint, lingering scent of honey and smoke clung to your robes. Precision mattered. The candles had to burn evenly, otherwise the light for the night's prayers would falter, leaving the cloistered monks in darkness and disrupting the spiritual rhythm that had guided the monastery for generations. In those long hours, time lost meaning. Your mind would wander to the manuscripts in the scriptorium, to the abbey's library, to the meals you had eaten in silence, and back again to the slow, hypnotic repetition of dipping, drying, and inspecting each candle. But candle making was not just a technical task. It was also an exercise in endurance and obedience. Fasting often accompanied labor, especially during penitential seasons like Lent. You might have spent days subsisting on bread, water, or thin gruel while bending over cauldrons, your stomach gnawing in protest. Hunger sharpened the senses in some ways but dulled them in others, making each moment in the workshop an exercise in self-discipline. The rule of Saint Benedict, which guided most monastic orders, emphasized that manual labor was as vital to spiritual life as prayer. And so, the candle workshop became a crucible of bodily endurance, a place where obedience and suffering intertwined. Accidents were common, despite your careful attention. Wax burns, minor scalds, or slips on wet floors could end a monk's day or worse, incapacitate him for weeks. The workshop itself had its own rhythms, sounds, and hazards. Clanging iron tools, the hiss of molten wax, and the occasional shout when a spill occurred formed the soundtrack of daily life. You learned quickly to anticipate danger, to respect the material, and to control your hands even when fatigue and hunger threatened to betray you. The physicality of the work was unrelenting. Few monks could sustain the pace for long without both skill and endurance. Yet within this routine, small innovations appeared. Some monks developed methods to recycle wax scraps, minimizing waste. Others experimented with wicks of different thickness or treated candles to improve their burn rate. These minor experiments, carried out quietly and without fanfare, were essential to the monastery's survival. The night services, the readings, and even the copying of manuscripts depended upon the light that these monks labored so hard to produce. You might imagine that your role was minor, almost invisible, yet in truth, it touched every aspect of monastic life. The work also revealed subtle hierarchies and tensions. Senior candle makers oversaw novices, offering guidance but also criticism. Mistakes, such as a candle that burned too quickly or unevenly, could result in public reprimand during the next communal meal or prayer session. The psychological pressure was as tangible as the physical labor. You were expected to maintain focus, precision, and piety simultaneously, a trifecta of endurance that few outside the monastery could fully comprehend. Beyond the practical, the workshop had a spiritual dimension. Candles were not merely tools, they symbolized divine light, guiding the faithful in darkness. Each candle you produced was an offering, a manifestation of devotion, and a reinforcement of the monastery's spiritual mission. You began to recognize that the act of candle making mirrored the larger patterns of monastic life: patience, repetition, careful attention, and the uncelebrated labor that underpinned spiritual and intellectual pursuits alike. And yet, as with any task done repeatedly, monotony carried its own dangers. Some monks reported strange dreams while working late into the night. Others spoke of whispering sounds near the wax cauldrons, faint and elusive. Perhaps these were imagined, born of exhaustion and silence, but in the cloistered monastery, the line between reality and superstition was thin. You might begin to wonder whether the wax itself held some mysterious power, whether the laborious repetition, the hunger, and the isolation were quietly shaping your mind in ways beyond comprehension. Hours passed, and the pile of completed candles grew. Each one represented hours of sweat, patience, and silent contemplation. And yet, for all the effort, you could not escape a gnawing question. How much of your labor was truly seen, and how much would be forgotten, leaving only the flickering light to testify to your toil? Even more unsettling, if the candles failed, if a fire occurred, or if a mistake went unnoticed, could the consequences reach beyond the monastery walls, affecting the lives of those who depended upon your light for spiritual guidance? In the dim glow of candlelight, as the last drops of molten wax hardened into slender pillars of light, you realized that the curse of the candle workshop was twofold. It demanded unending physical labor while offering almost no recognition, and it carried a subtle but persistent threat: the knowledge that a single misstep could have consequences far greater than your immediate understanding. You left the workshop weary, your hands sticky and blistered, carrying the weight of your responsibility along with the quiet awareness that your work was crucial to sustaining life, devotion, and knowledge within the cloistered walls. And yet, despite the danger, the monotony, and the invisible burden, you could not stop. The candles needed to burn, the monks needed their light, and the rhythm of monastic life depended upon the unseen labor that went into every glowing flame. Perhaps, you thought, this was the essence of monastic devotion, the quiet, unglamorous endurance of duty, even when the world beyond the walls knew nothing of your work. As you finally washed your hands in cold water and prepared for the next bell, one lingering question remained. In a monastery devoted to obedience, fasting, and labor, how much human curiosity, error, or ingenuity could survive unnoticed? And how many of the secrets hidden in shadows, the mistakes, the experiments, the whispers of rebellion might one day emerge to challenge the quiet order you had spent so long preserving? The candle workshop was deceptively tranquil during the day, but as the afternoon waned and shadows lengthened, an almost imperceptible tension began to settle over the room. The same monotonous rhythm that brought comfort now threatened disaster. A stray flicker, a slip of the hand, or a misplaced wick could send molten wax onto the wooden floors. Fires were the silent threat of the monastery, a danger magnified by fasting bodies, numb fingers, and hours of unbroken labor. You would notice how monks navigated the workspace with the precision of soldiers, each movement calculated, each step deliberate. The iron cauldrons of wax, heated to a dangerously precise temperature, emitted both the sweet scent of honey and the faint menace of smoke. Even the smallest miscalculation could ignite a flame. You, like others, learned to respect the heat not just for your physical safety, but for the survival of the monastery itself. A single fire could destroy centuries of labor in the scriptorium, the library, and the workshops, wiping out irreplaceable manuscripts and artworks in a matter of minutes. Fasting intensified the risks. Hunger dulled focus, but spiritual discipline demanded it. During penitential seasons, you might work long hours on sticky, blistering hands, barely nourished, relying on discipline and prayer to maintain steadiness. Some monks embraced this as part of their devotion. Others struggled, feeling the gnawing weakness of empty stomachs while handling molten wax. The paradox was clear. Survival required care, but devotion required sacrifice, and the boundary between the two was perilously thin. Hierarchy dictated both safety and authority. Senior candle makers, often stern and unyielding, oversaw novices with relentless vigilance. Mistakes were not taken lightly. A candle that burned unevenly might seem minor, yet in a monastery devoted to precision, it was a visible sign of inattention, perhaps even spiritual weakness. You might have seen a novice trembling under the gaze of a master, desperately trying to adjust the wick, praying silently that the error would go unnoticed. These moments of scrutiny were part of the workshop's invisible curriculum, teaching discipline through subtle fear as much as instruction. But there were also unsanctioned experiments hidden among the wax and wicks. Some monks, curious or bored, would test new methods, blending tallow with beeswax to see if it improved burn duration, or adding scents and oils, knowing that the risk of fire increased. These acts were often small rebellions against monotony, expressions of creativity, or practical attempts to improve the candles. Yet each experiment carried risk not just of flames, but of censure, because deviation from prescribed methods could be interpreted as pride or disobedience, a dangerous spiritual failing. Psychological tension ran as deep as physical danger. Working in near silence, with only the occasional hiss of wax or the scrape of wicks for company, monks were prone to vivid inner lives. Fatigue brought hallucination, shadows that shifted independently of candlelight, whispers that seemed to echo from walls. Some claimed to see spectral figures flitting among the cauldrons, perhaps visions of saints, perhaps warnings of unseen peril. You might have felt a chill as you watched a pool of molten wax ripple, unsure if it was the reflection of candlelight or something more uncanny. The line between devotion and dread was blurred, and navigating it was part of survival. Safety measures were as much spiritual as physical. Prayers accompanied every stage of candle making, often murmured in rhythm with repetitive tasks. The act of lighting a candle was simultaneously a ritual of protection, a safeguard against accident, and an offering to the divine. You learned to approach the cauldron with reverence, treating molten wax as a sacred substance as much as a dangerous one. Yet reverence did not remove the possibility of harm. Fingers blistered, hands blackened, and the air filled with the scent of burnt honey when errors occurred. The lesson was relentless. Devotion demanded diligence, but the consequences of lapse were immediate and tangible. Despite the monotony, camaraderie emerged in subtle ways. A nod, a glance, or a quietly shared observation could communicate reassurance and guidance. Experienced monks often coached novices silently, demonstrating the proper angle of dipping or the precise timing for drying. These unspoken lessons became lifelines, passing down knowledge that was never fully codified in writing, yet crucial for survival. The scriptorium and candle workshop were parallel realms of preservation, one for knowledge, the other for light. Both depended on repetition, discipline, and human endurance. Yet shadows of human ambition persisted. Some monks coveted recognition for subtle innovations or efficiency, even though official acknowledgement was rare. Others hoarded secrets, techniques, small improvements, or hidden knowledge of safer processes, balancing obedience with self-interest. The interplay between individual curiosity and communal rules created an invisible tension, quietly shaping behavior and decisions. You might notice the same monk who meticulously layered wicks, also subtly guiding the novices in risky new techniques, testing the boundaries of both fire and authority. As night fell fully, the candle workshop became a theater of quiet tension. Wax cooled, smoke curled, and the faint scent of honey lingered in the air. You paused to observe your own hands, blackened and sticky, reflecting on the fragility of your labor. One careless motion, one lapse in attention, and months of painstaking work could vanish. Yet beyond physical danger, a deeper awareness persisted. Every candle carried significance beyond the walls of the workshop. It illuminated scripture, guided prayers, and enabled the work of scribes and monks elsewhere. You realized that your tiny act of labor rippled outward, touching lives in ways both mundane and profound. And then, just as you prepared to leave, a small disaster revealed itself. A cauldron had begun to overheat, threatening a larger conflagration. The warning came too late for complacency. Reflex and experience were all that stood between disaster and catastrophe. In those tense moments, every skill, every lesson from long hours of toil mattered. Survival was physical, spiritual, and psychological. The workshop demanded mastery of all three. The incident was resolved, but the memory lingered. You recognized that the candle workshop, with its hidden dangers, required constant vigilance, not just for survival but for the preservation of the monastic order itself. And yet, questions remained. How much risk could a monk endure before exhaustion, curiosity, or ambition overcame caution? How many small lapses went unnoticed, quietly shaping the world in ways no one realized? In the candle workshop, light was both a tool and a test, a fragile, flickering testament to human endurance, devotion, and the quiet labor that sustained monastic life. And as you stepped into the cloistered corridors, the weight of responsibility pressed upon you. The line between devotion and disaster, obedience and innovation, was thinner than you had ever imagined. By the early hours of the morning, the candle workshop had quieted, though the faint glow of a few surviving flames lingered. You stood among piles of candles, exhausted, your hands blistered and blackened, the smell of honeyed wax clinging stubbornly to your robes. Hours of repetitive labor had left your muscles aching, your stomach hollow from fasting, And yet, the work was far from over. The flickering light reminded you of the duality of your labor. Each candle was both a tool for spiritual guidance and a potential instrument of destruction. Earlier in the night, the small mishap with the overheated cauldron had highlighted a stark truth. The physical and spiritual demands of the candle workshop were inseparable. The same hands that produced light could just as easily trigger ruin. You realized that survival in this environment depended on more than skill alone. It required constant mindfulness, discipline, and a deep awareness of both danger and consequence. Every movement, every dip of a wick, carried weight beyond the immediate task. Monks who worked in the workshop were acutely aware of this tension. There was a fine line between devotion and recklessness, between obedience and curiosity. Many had witnessed colleagues narrowly avoid disaster, a cauldron tipping, a candle igniting nearby parchment, or a hurried mistake during a fast leading to burns or injury. Each incident served as both warning and lesson, reinforcing the strict discipline demanded by the monastery. In this environment, monotony was protective, repetition was essential, and focus was survival. Yet despite the relentless labor, human ingenuity persisted. You noticed how senior monks carefully balanced efficiency with safety, introducing subtle methods to recycle wax or maintain temperature without risking combustion. Novices watched and learned, their hands guided silently, their minds absorbing lessons beyond what was written in any manual. These unspoken rules of survival were as vital as prayers or the rule of Saint Benedict itself. The workshop was both a classroom and a crucible, shaping character and endurance in ways that were invisible outside the monastery walls. Spiritual significance infused every action. Candles were not mere objects, they were conduits of devotion. Lighting a candle for prayer, allowing it to burn steadily through a vigil, represented faith, guidance, and protection. You began to understand that your labor was not only a practical necessity, but also a spiritual act. Each layer of wax, each careful adjustment of a wick, was a meditation, a ritual that connected your suffering and patience to a larger purpose. Even fasting, the gnawing hunger that tested focus, and became a form of discipline aligning body, mind, and spirit with the demands of the task. But monotony and danger were constant companions. Fatigue made the hands unsteady, hunger dulled reflexes, and the weight of responsibility pressed heavily on the mind. You knew that mistakes could have consequences far beyond the workshop. A fire could destroy manuscripts, halt night vigils, or even imperil the lives of monks and the community beyond the monastery walls. And yet, this danger also sharpened the senses, creating a paradoxical environment where repetition, risk, and devotion intertwined. You learned to move instinctively, guided by both experience and caution, aware that survival required the perfect balance of skill, patience, and vigilance. Social dynamics added another layer of complexity. Senior monks, though disciplined and often demanding, acted as both guides and gatekeepers. They monitored for mistakes, reinforced tradition, and subtly tested the endurance of novices. A single misstep could invite correction, reprimand, or humiliation, but it also reinforced the communal understanding that the work mattered far beyond individual recognition. You realized that obedience, discipline, and respect for hierarchy were not merely social conventions, they were survival strategies in a world defined by fragile materials, volatile fire, and human limitation. And yet, curiosity persisted. Some monks experimented with wax blends, wick designs, or even scented candles. These small innovations were technically outside the strict rules, yet they often improved the product. You might have felt the thrill and fear of discovery, the excitement of trying something new balanced against the knowledge that even minor deviations could provoke spiritual or social consequences. The workshop, while physically confined, became a space of subtle negotiation between obedience, creativity, and the pursuit of better methods. As dawn approached, the workshop fell silent. You surveyed the completed candles, their smooth surfaces reflecting the weak morning light. They were ordinary, unremarkable to outsiders, yet they represented hours of unacknowledged labor, painstaking attention, and devotion tested against fire, hunger, and monotony. You reflected on the paradox. The work was invisible to the world, yet indispensable to sustaining the spiritual and intellectual life of the monastery. The candles, fragile and fleeting, carried with them both light and the weight of human endurance. That quiet moment, you understood the essential lesson of the candle workshop. Devotion was inseparable from discipline, creativity was inseparable from risk, and survival required constant awareness of both material and spiritual demands. The monks who labored there preserved more than light, they preserved order, ritual, and the continuity of monastic life itself. Each flame illuminated more than walls and manuscripts. It illuminated the quiet perseverance of ordinary human effort. And yet, lingering questions remained. How many potential disasters were averted by instinct alone? How much knowledge, insight, or technique was lost to fear or obedience? And perhaps most pressing, how much of the human ingenuity quietly nurtured in these dim workshops would ever reach the outside world, if at all? The candle workshop, with its heat, wax, and relentless repetition, was more than a space of labor. It was a crucible of endurance, a test of faith, and a repository of human resilience. And as you stepped into the cloistered halls, exhausted but vigilant, you knew that the flickering light you had created was a silent testament to the hidden, often dangerous, work that sustained both life and devotion in the medieval monastery. Reflection. In the candle workshop, ordinary labor became extraordinary. Through fasting, repetition, and quiet ingenuity, monks maintained the spiritual and practical infrastructure of their monasteries. Their hidden work reminds us that much of history depends on the unglamorous endurance of ordinary people, their vigilance, creativity, and willingness to face danger, often without recognition. Story 3. Monastic medicine, herbs, leeching, and accidental deaths. You enter the monastery not just as a place of prayer, study, or labor, but also as a sanctuary for the sick, the wounded, and the desperate. Within the walls of many medieval abbeys, including those from the 11th through the 14th centuries, there existed a space that functioned as both a hospital and a laboratory, the infirmary. Here, monks dedicated themselves to preserving health through observation, herbal remedies, and careful documentation. Yet the reality of this work was far less noble than the serene depictions in later manuscripts. It was tedious, sometimes dangerous, and fraught with trial and error. The life of a medical monk began before dawn, as always, with prayer. But after chanting matins, you would move to the infirmary, a long, narrow room with stone floors and sunlight streaming through narrow windows, illuminating beds lined with straw and linen. Patients, often the elderly, sickly novices, or travelers seeking refuge, lay quietly, coughing, shivering, or groaning from pain. Your task was to observe, prepare remedies, and apply treatments, often with little guidance beyond centuries of monastic experience and tradition. Herbs were your primary tools. The monastery maintained gardens specifically for medicinal plants, sage, thyme, rosemary, and more obscure species whose names now barely survive in historical records. Each plant was carefully harvested, dried, and prepared as poultices, teas, or tinctures. Timing, dosage, and preparation were vital. Too little and the treatment was ineffective. Too much and it could be fatal. You learned quickly that your hands, though steady from scriptorium work or candle making, could just as easily deliver life or death. Leeching, one of the more infamous practices, was equally delicate. You would collect blood with careful incisions or by attaching live leeches to the skin, believing it would balance the humors, the prevailing theory of medicine at the time. You might have watched a patient pale, faint, or cry out as the leech adhered, and yet your hand had to remain calm and precise. Mistakes could lead to excessive blood loss, infection, or even death. The stakes were always tangible. Human life, fragile and precious, rested on your attention to the minutiae of preparation and application. The infirmary was also a place of observation. Monks kept careful notes on symptoms, remedies, and outcomes, often in marginalia or small notebooks. You might record that a decoction of rue and chamomile relieved fever in one patient, only to note later that another patient reacted poorly. These observations were painstakingly gathered over decades, forming a slow, incremental knowledge base that would, in many cases, outlast the abbey itself. Yet the process was frustratingly slow. Many treatments failed, and the line between efficacy and superstition was blurred. You learned to navigate both, balancing empirical observation with prayer, ritual, and belief in divine intervention. In addition to herbs and leeches, other remedies were common: poultices of crushed bread and honey, wine infused with herbs, or warm compresses applied to aching joints. You may have noticed that even the most minor actions, washing a wound, positioning a patient, or preparing a mixture, required careful attention. A spilled potion could stain linens or floors, and a miscalculation could turn a remedy into poison. The monotony of preparation was both protective and oppressive, reinforcing discipline while constantly reminding you of human vulnerability. Accidents were inevitable. Novices, inexperienced in preparation, could mislabel tinctures, confuse herbs, or administer treatments too aggressively. You might have seen a patient worsen despite careful treatment, or observed a minor infection spread rapidly due to poor hygiene. Even seasoned monks were not immune to error. In some abbeys, death records were kept meticulously, not merely as a matter of piety, but as a means of learning from failure, tracing which remedies, diets, or practices succeeded, and which led to unintended harm. The psychological toll was immense. Constant exposure to suffering, disease, and death weighed heavily on the mind. You would witness fragile lives end quietly in the infirmary beds, and yet your labor must continue uninterrupted. Compassion and endurance became intertwined as you moved mechanically between tasks, preparing poultices, tending wounds, and recording outcomes. Spiritual practice offered solace, but it did not remove the pervasive awareness of human frailty. Hierarchy played a subtle role in medical work as in other monastic labor. Senior monks oversaw treatment, advised novices, and occasionally intervened in critical cases. Decisions were often guided by accumulated experience rather than textbooks, which were scarce or incomplete. Observing their measured movements, you would learn to emulate precision, patience, and humility. Mistakes were recorded, corrected, and silently remembered, shaping the culture of care within the abbey. Yet the work was not purely scientific, even by medieval standards. Spiritual remedies, prayers, relics, and rituals were often administered alongside physical treatment. You might offer a tincture of lavender to relieve anxiety while reciting psalms over a patient's bed. Both practices were considered essential, reflecting the belief that health was both a physical and spiritual state. The line between medicine and faith was thin, and your labor straddled both domains, demanding rigor in action and devotion in thought. Despite the dangers, there was reward in small successes: a fever reduced, a wound healed, a patient able to rise again. These moments were fleeting but powerful, affirming that your careful attention, repetition, and adherence to monastic discipline had tangible impact. And yet, as the sun set and the infirmary quieted, lingering questions remained. How much of what you practiced was effective, and how much merely placated fear, ritual, or hope? Which remedies would survive the test of time, and which would vanish into obscurity with the monks who practiced them? In the dimming light, as you cleaned tools, sorted herbs, and prepared for evening prayer, one thought pressed upon you. Life in the monastery was a delicate balance of endurance, observation, and devotion. Even minor errors could have monumental consequences, yet the continuity of care, the preservation of knowledge, and the quiet persistence of labor kept the abbey alive, and its inhabitants healthy, or as healthy as the unpredictable medieval world allowed. And so you left the infirmary, mindful of the risks, humbled by the responsibility, and aware that the unseen, repetitive labor of monks had shaped not only their own world, but also the foundations of medicine, observation, and knowledge for centuries to come. A question lingered in your mind as the candles flickered low. In a world built on trial, error, and devotion, how much human ingenuity and perseverance was truly hidden behind the walls of the monastery, waiting to emerge or be lost forever? By mid-morning, the infirmary had become a carefully orchestrated theater of observation, preparation, and labor. The air was thick with scents, pungent herbs drying in clay pots, the faint iron tang of blood, and the subtle sweetness of honey used in poultices. You moved among the beds, attending to patients whose ailments ranged from simple fevers to wounds inflicted in skirmishes or accidents outside the abbey walls. Each task demanded vigilance. Even a minor lapse, a misapplied poultice, or an incorrect measurement of a tincture could turn hope into tragedy. You learned quickly that monastic medicine was a delicate interplay of observation, tradition, and experimentation. Some treatments were documented in texts brought from distant abbeys. Others were transmitted orally, refined through generations of trial and error. You might carefully weigh herbs with a small scale, grind roots into powder, or steep flowers in wine, all while comparing results to prior notes. There was a rhythm to this labor, a combination of repetition and meticulous care that mirrored the scriptorium, yet the stakes were higher. Here, lives could be lost, not just knowledge. Leeching remained both a trusted and perilous practice. You would watch as bloodletting was performed with careful precision, noting the patient's skin, pulse, and color. An inexperienced hand could remove too much blood, weakening the patient further, while a timid one might leave behind harmful humors. Even when executed correctly, the procedure demanded vigilance. Leeches could carry disease, the wounds could fester, and the patient's reaction could vary unpredictably. Each treatment was an experiment with consequences, a reminder of human fragility and the limits of knowledge. The monks relied heavily on herbal remedies, yet even these posed subtle dangers. Plants like belladonna or hemlock, if misidentified or misapplied, could kill. You might carefully label tinctures, cross-checking each preparation, knowing that the slightest confusion could be fatal. Accidental deaths, though rare, were recorded quietly and reflected upon as lessons for future practice. You would observe the senior medical monks navigating these moments with quiet authority, balancing empathy with discipline, treating each case as both a spiritual and practical responsibility. Beyond the immediate physical labor, there was a moral dimension to your work, which patients deserved intensive care and which treatments were too risky. When resources, herbs, wine, or even water were limited, difficult choices arose. You had to weigh the chance of success against potential harm, always mindful that your decisions could alter the course of a life. Mistakes were never fully erased. They lingered as quiet reminders of human imperfection. The infirmary, in this sense, was a place where ethics, observation, and devotion collided daily. Isolation played a role as well. In some abbeys, medical monks were tasked with tending patients who were contagious, including those suffering from smallpox, leprosy, or other infections. The air in these rooms carried the faint stench of illness, and you worked carefully to avoid contamination while applying remedies or adjusting bedding. Protective measures were rudimentary, often consisting of ritual prayers or physical barriers, but exposure was inevitable. You might leave the infirmary fatigued, your mind heavy with both the physical toll of labor and the awareness of the invisible risks you carried with you. Observation was perhaps the most critical skill. You were trained to notice subtle changes, a shift in pulse, a new color in a rash, the way a patient moved or spoke. Each detail informed treatment decisions, allowing you to adjust remedies or apply additional care. The act of seeing, recording, and interpreting data was painstaking, often tedious and fraught with uncertainty. You could never be sure if your observations were accurate or if unseen factors poisoned herbs, environmental conditions, or simple human error would undo your careful work. Yet hidden knowledge persisted, quietly shaping the effectiveness of the abbey's care. Some monks experimented with combinations of herbs, new applications, or alternative remedies that straddled the line between tradition and innovation. These experiments, often unrecorded or hidden in marginal notes, reflected both curiosity and necessity, the drive to heal, improve, and understand within a framework constrained by obedience and limited resources. You might stumble upon such a note, revealing a subtle correction to a treatment, a tip for avoiding infection, or a recipe for an unexpected cure. It was knowledge gained through trial, risk, and keen observation, but it was also fragile, easily lost if the monk who held it departed, fell ill, or died. The human element remained unavoidable. Patients reacted unpredictably, sometimes defying expectations, sometimes succumbing despite the best efforts of the monks. You learned humility through repeated failure, understanding that outcomes were influenced by forces beyond preparation, divine will, random chance, and the intricate fragility of the human body. Every success was hard-won. Every failure was a lesson etched into memory and practice. And through it all, questions loomed. How much of what you practiced truly healed, and how much merely consoled the patient or conformed to tradition? How many lives were saved by intuition, skill, and careful observation, and how many were lost due to error or misjudgment? You understood that medieval monastic medicine was not simply about curing the sick, it was a balancing act between knowledge and ignorance, action and restraint, faith and empirical observation. By the end of the day, as you cleaned herbs, prepared tinctures for the next morning, and recorded outcomes, the infirmary fell silent once more. You reflected on the weight of responsibility carried by a few dedicated hands and minds, lives preserved, knowledge compiled, and human perseverance quietly exercised behind stone walls. And yet, as you stepped out into the cloistered corridors, one question lingered. In a world defined by error and endurance, how much knowledge would endure and how many lessons would vanish, buried in the quiet toil of generations past? By dawn, the infirmary had fallen into a fragile quiet. You walked among the beds, noting the patients who had survived the night, their breathing steady, eyes alert, and skin warmer. Yet others lay pale and weak, their remedies insufficient or misapplied. The day's labor hours spent grinding herbs, applying poultices, and balancing the humors was both invisible and monumental. The monks who practiced medicine carried the dual weight of responsibility and uncertainty, knowing that human lives hung on the precise execution of repetitive, often tedious tasks. Accidents, though minimized through experience, were inevitable. A mismeasured dose of a tincture could weaken a patient instead of healing them. A leech removed too late or too early could tip the body into further imbalance. Each failure was recorded carefully, not as punishment, but as documentation for future practice. You understood that monastic medicine was cumulative. The collective knowledge of decades or even centuries was preserved in meticulous marginalia, subtle annotations, and hands-on teaching. The work was as much about continuity as cure. Yet the dangers extended beyond miscalculation. Disease, in its invisible and unpredictable forms, remained an ever-present adversary. Even the most vigilant monks were vulnerable to contagion, and isolation was imperfect. Some treatments, though well-intentioned, inadvertently spread infection. Crowded infirmaries, shared tools, and minimal sanitation allowed pathogens to travel silently. You moved carefully, washing hands in cold water, applying vinegar or wine to instruments, and murmuring prayers over each patient. But you knew that some outcomes were beyond human control. Survival was as much a product of circumstance as skill. Despite the dangers, small victories were profound. A patient who had been bedridden for weeks could rise again, nourished by careful preparation, observation, and treatment. A wound that had resisted healing might finally close with a poultice of honey and thyme. These successes were quietly celebrated, often without fanfare, yet they were monumental. Lives saved, suffering eased, and the monastery sustained as a functioning community. You realize that even the most unremarkable actions, grinding a root, tying a bandage, or monitoring a fever, could ripple outward, preserving both life and knowledge in ways invisible to the outside world. Hidden within this labor was innovation, though rarely acknowledged. Some monks experimented with alternative preparations, testing subtle variations in dosage, combinations of herbs, or the application of heat and pressure. Many of these experiments were documented only in the margins of texts, encoded in shorthand, or remembered orally. They were fragile pieces of knowledge, subject to the whims of survival, obedience, and chance. You might stumble upon a forgotten note describing a successful treatment for a common ailment. Centuries before its methods were formally understood, an unrecognized triumph of observation and perseverance. Ethical dilemmas were omnipresent. When resources were scarce, decisions about who received care, how much treatment could be applied, or when to conserve herbs weighed heavily on the monks' minds. Each choice had consequences, tangible and intangible. You were constantly negotiating between the limits of human skill, the expectations of the monastic community, and the unseen hand of fate or divine will. Every patient became a study in humility, a reminder of both human ingenuity and vulnerability. As the sun climbed, illuminating the infirmary in soft, golden light, you reflected on the delicate balance of life and labor. The work was monotonous, demanding, and often dangerous, but it was also transformative. You witnessed firsthand how careful observation, repetition, and devotion could sustain human life and knowledge through centuries of uncertainty and scarcity. Every herbal remedy, every careful incision, every recorded observation was a testament to the persistence and resilience of the human spirit. Yet the shadow of uncertainty persisted. For every success, there were mistakes quietly noted, failures buried in records, and lessons lost to those who left or died without passing on their knowledge. You realized that medieval monastic medicine was less about certainty and more about adaptation, the meticulous cultivation of skill, observation, and endurance in a world dominated by unpredictable forces. It was a discipline forged in repetition, observation, and faith, where even the smallest actions carried profound significance. The infirmary, like the scriptorium or the candle workshop, was a hidden engine of medieval society. Its laborers, though often anonymous, shaped the survival of communities, preserved techniques, and laid the groundwork for centuries of medical knowledge. You understood that these quiet acts of observation and care, often uncelebrated, were central to the continuity of human understanding. And as you finally stepped into the cloistered corridors, hands weary, mind alert, and heart humbled, you pondered the lasting lesson. The endurance of life, the preservation of knowledge, and the delicate balance between healing and harm rested not only on skill or ritual, but on patience, observation, and the quiet, repetitive labor of ordinary people. A final question lingered in your thoughts. How many of these insights, recorded in marginalia, whispered in instruction, or discovered through trial, had survived the centuries, only to shape modern medicine quietly, invisibly, and almost accidentally? Reflection. Monastic medicine was a quiet intersection of labor, observation, and devotion. Lives were preserved not through drama, but through careful repetition, subtle experimentation, and endurance. The monks' meticulous work reminds us that much of history and human knowledge is sustained by ordinary individuals whose perseverance quietly outlasts centuries. Story 4. The Hidden Kitchens, Famine, Rats, and the Monks Who Ate Last. The monastery kitchen was a place few outsiders ever glimpsed, and for good reason. It was as chaotic as it was essential. Here, the hidden labor of medieval monks intersected with survival, discipline, and hierarchy. While the cloisters and scriptorium preserved knowledge, the kitchen preserved life itself, and in a world defined by scarcity, that was no small responsibility. You might enter the kitchen before dawn, when the chill of the morning hung thick in the stone corridors. The hearths were cold initially, only to be stoked into roaring flames that would bake bread, boil gruel, and roast whatever meat or vegetables the abbey could acquire. Smoke clung to the low ceilings, and the scent of burning wood mixed with the pungent aroma of curing herbs and stale grains. You would quickly learn that every task in the kitchen, chopping, kneading, stirring, cleaning, was governed by meticulous order, for the smallest mistake could ruin the meal or provoke scarcity later in the week. Food was a constant challenge. Medieval monasteries, dependent on surrounding farmland, seasonal harvests, and occasional donations, rarely enjoyed abundance. You might have faced days when the grain supply ran low, when vegetables were scarce, or when meat was reserved only for the infirmary or senior monks. Meals followed a strict hierarchy. Novices and younger monks often ate last, after the elders had taken their portions. You learned patience, endurance, and humility, values reinforced not only by spiritual doctrine, but by the practical realities of famine and rationing. Even routine tasks were fraught with challenges. Grains could be infested with weevils, bread dough might fail to rise, and pests, especially rats, threatened both food and safety. You would spend hours cleaning floors, repairing storage barrels, and guarding the granaries, understanding that even a small lapse could result in spoiled food or disease. Famine was not an abstract concept. It was tangible, immediate, and relentless. You felt it in the thin broth of morning gruel, in the measured slices of bread, and in the gnawing awareness that your survival depended on careful management of scarce resources. The kitchen also demanded laborious precision. Bread making alone was a process of patience and timing, kneading the dough until it achieved the correct elasticity, allowing it to rise in warm, dry conditions, and baking it evenly over fluctuating hearth temperatures. Failure could result in dense, inedible loaves or burnt crusts that wasted precious flour. The repetition of these tasks built skill, yes, but also monotony. You learned to move mechanically, relying on experience rather than attention, allowing muscle memory to guide each motion, while your mind drifted into quiet reflection or prayer. Hierarchy was ever present in the kitchen. Senior cooks directed novices with quiet authority, assigning chores, inspecting food, and ensuring that everything adhered to both the rule of Saint Benedict and the practical necessities of survival. Mistakes, while not always punished harshly, carried subtle consequences. A reprimand, a doubled workload, or the quiet acknowledgement that an inferior loaf or poorly cleaned pan had disrupted communal life. Even the act of eating was governed by ritual. Meals were taken in silence or accompanied by readings from Scripture, a daily reminder that sustenance was intertwined with devotion. But despite the monotony, there were moments of ingenuity. Monks experimented with new recipes, preservation methods, or ways to stretch limited ingredients further. Herbs were added to disguise spoilage or enhance flavor. Grains were combined with pulses to increase nutrition, and fermentation techniques were refined to produce stable, long-lasting foods. These small innovations often went unrecorded, hidden in marginal notes or passed orally to apprentices. You understood that survival depended as much on creativity as on obedience, and that the monastery's continued health relied on both. Pest management remained a relentless concern. Rats and mice prowled the storerooms at night, gnawing on stored grains and spreading disease. You might have been woken to chase them away or found yourself tracking their damage during daily inspections. The work was tedious, unpleasant, and yet vital. A single infestation could devastate food supplies, leaving the community vulnerable to malnutrition or famine. This vigilance demanded patience, observation, and a willingness to endure discomfort, qualities the monastery cultivated in all aspects of life. Even the simplest act of eating carried lessons. Meals were sparse, yet every morsel mattered. Novices were taught humility by waiting their turn, observing propriety, and consuming only what was allotted. You might have eaten thin gruel while senior monks enjoyed thick porridge or roasted vegetables. The physical hunger was constant, but the spiritual training was deliberate. Self-restraint, gratitude, and awareness of the community's dependence on collective labor. As the day progressed, the kitchen moved from preparation to service. Trays of food were distributed to the dining hall, where silence and ritual shaped the experience. Each loaf of bread, each bowl of soup, carried the labor of countless hands: milled grain, stoked hearths, cleaned pots, and meticulous rationing. You might reflect on the invisible web of effort required to sustain the monastery, recognizing that life itself depended on routine, patience, and repetitive labor as much as divine providence. And yet, as the last of the meal was consumed and the kitchen quieted, you could not ignore the lingering questions. How much scarcity shaped not just the body, but the character and spirituality of those who lived under such strict limitations? How many lives were preserved or lost due to the meticulous work of unseen hands, and how many lessons, culinary, hygienic, or spiritual, were lost with those who labored silently, without recognition? In that quiet, smoky kitchen, you realized the essential truth of monastic survival. Life depended not on glory, but on endurance, careful observation, and the relentless repetition of small, often unpleasant tasks. Every loaf baked, every pest removed, every ration measured carried consequences that extended beyond the moment, shaping the health, discipline, and continuity of the monastic community itself. A question lingered as you left the hearths to prepare for evening prayers. In a world where survival depended on such unseen labor, how much knowledge, wisdom, or human ingenuity would remain hidden forever, tucked behind the stone walls and worn floors of the monastery kitchen? By mid-morning, the monastery kitchen had fully awakened. Hearths roared with fire, cauldrons of gruel simmered, and the scent of baking bread filled the air. Yet beneath this apparent order, chaos lingered in quiet ways. Scarcity was a constant companion. Grain stocks fluctuated with the successive harvests, vegetable yields were at the mercy of weather and pests, and any meat brought from the surrounding villages was carefully rationed. The reality of survival demanded vigilance, ingenuity, and relentless repetition in every aspect of kitchen life. You would notice how labor was meticulously divided. Senior monks oversaw the processes: grinding grain, stirring stews, managing wood for the hearth. Novices executed the repetitive, often exhausting tasks, from cleaning floors and cutting vegetables to repairing storage barrels. Each movement had to be precise. Mismanaged firewood could overheat a cauldron, mismeasured flour could ruin a loaf, and a single infestation in the granary could leave the community hungry for days. The mundane routines were therefore anything but trivial. They were critical acts of survival. Rats and other vermin were persistent threats. Even with careful storage in barrels and granaries, these creatures gnawed at food stores under the cover of darkness, leaving behind droppings that could spoil supplies or transmit disease. You might spend hours chasing them, setting traps, or reinforcing storage containers, knowing that a single lapse could multiply scarcity into crisis. Their presence was a reminder that survival was never guaranteed, and that life depended as much on vigilance as it did on the labor of hands and minds. Famine sharpened the ethical and psychological challenges of kitchen labor. When supplies ran low, decisions about rationing became moral as well as practical. Who received the last portions of bread? How could meals be stretched to sustain both novices and elders, while ensuring that the sick or infirm were not neglected? You learned that scarcity shaped not only the body but the mind. It demanded discipline, humility, and acute awareness of both human need and social hierarchy. Every loaf baked, every ration measured, carried consequences far beyond the moment. Monks developed subtle systems to cope with scarcity. Herbs were added to dishes for nutrition or flavor, scraps were repurposed into broths, and fermentation techniques were refined to preserve vegetables for weeks. Small innovations, though rarely celebrated, allowed the monastery to endure even in years of poor harvests. You might note that much of this knowledge was tacit, passed quietly from elder cooks to novices, written only in shorthand, or remembered through practice rather than formal instruction. The work was invisible to outsiders, but indispensable to survival. The psychological weight of constant labor was relentless. Monks worked in near silence, with the occasional whispered instruction or admonishment from a senior cook. You would notice the strain in their movements, weary hands chopping, backs bent over cauldrons, eyes squinting at the faint glow of embers. The repetitive labor demanded focus, endurance, and an almost meditative patience. Yet monotony was not merely tedious. It was protective, training both body and mind to navigate scarcity with precision and discipline. Hierarchy structured not just labor but survival. Novices often ate last, observing the elders consume their portions first, learning humility through both ritual and necessity. Mistakes in preparation or rationing could provoke subtle reprimands, doubling workloads, or temporary exclusion from preferred tasks. You would realize that obedience, careful attention, and respect for authority were not merely spiritual virtues. They were strategies for survival in a fragile environment where missteps carried tangible consequences. Even the simplest meals were exercises in endurance. Thin gruel, rough bread, or occasionally roasted vegetables constituted daily sustenance. Meals were quiet, often accompanied by readings from scripture rather than conversation. You might reflect that, in this environment, discipline was inseparable from physical survival. Hunger, monotony, and repetition cultivated both resilience and skill. Every bite, every careful action and preparation reinforced a connection between labor, sustenance, and devotion. Yet hidden beneath the monotony were subtle opportunities for human ingenuity. Monks experimented with fermentation, preservation, and creative use of herbs, sometimes discovering techniques that allowed food to last longer or taste better. These innovations, while minor in appearance, had profound effects. They increased survival rates, sustained morale, and reinforced the monastery's ability to endure scarcity. You might imagine the satisfaction of witnessing a loaf rise perfectly after days of careful preparation, a tangible reward for both skill and patience. As the day progressed and the kitchen fell into a quieter rhythm, the human element remained ever present. Fatigue, hunger, and the awareness of scarcity created tension, yet also fostered subtle cooperation. Monks learned to anticipate each other's movements, to share tasks silently, and to maintain vigilance over food, fire, and cleanliness. The kitchen, like other monastic spaces, was a delicate ecosystem where endurance, observation, and careful labor ensured both survival and continuity. And as evening approached, the kitchen quieted, leaving behind the lingering smell of smoke, herbs, and baked bread. You might pause to consider the countless hours of labor, vigilance, and careful decision-making required to sustain life within the monastery. The unseen toil of the kitchen was as critical as the work of the scriptorium or infirmary, yet it was rarely recognized outside the cloistered walls. A question lingered as the last embers dimmed. In a world dependent on hidden labor and meticulous endurance, how much knowledge culinary, hygienic, or practical would be lost, and how many lessons from famine, scarcity, and human resilience would survive only in the silent memory of the monks who labored unseen. By late evening, the kitchen had fallen into a hushed calm. The hearths had cooled, embers glowed faintly, and the air carried the lingering scent of herbs, smoke, and stale bread. You stood amid the remnants of the day's labor, empty bowls, stacked loaves, and carefully stored ingredients awaiting tomorrow's work. The weight of responsibility, the care, vigilance, and endurance required to sustain the monastery settled on your shoulders. You understood that survival depended not on grandeur or wealth, but on repetition, patience, and attention to detail. The day had been a delicate balance of labor, observation, and foresight. Scarce ingredients were stretched through careful rationing. Pests were kept at bay through vigilance and ingenuity. Fires were managed with precision to ensure that each loaf, stew, or broth was edible. Every minor success bread that rose evenly, vegetables preserved without spoilage. A granary free of rats was monumental in a world where scarcity could tip the balance between survival and famine. you realize that the work of the kitchen was as much about prevention as it was about preparation. Hierarchy shaped both labor and sustenance. Novices had learned humility by eating last, observing elders first, and practicing patience in the face of scarcity. Senior monks guided labor with quiet authority, correcting mistakes, sharing subtle tips, and ensuring that efficiency did not compromise survival. You might have noticed that even small innovations, adding herbs to prolong freshness, experimenting with fermentation, or carefully tracking the use of grains, were implemented quietly, often without acknowledgement, yet they had a profound impact on the monastery's endurance. The psychological weight of constant labor was ever present. Hunger gnawed at your focus, fatigue dulled reflexes, and the monotony of repeated tasks could numb the mind. Yet repetition also trained resilience. Muscle memory guided chopping, stirring, and kneading. Awareness sharpened vigilance against pests and spoilage, and spiritual discipline reinforced patience and humility. The kitchen became a crucible, shaping not only skill but character, endurance, and foresight. Accidents and scarcity were inevitable, but they also cultivated ingenuity. Monks discovered ways to preserve food longer, combine ingredients creatively, and stretch limited supplies while maintaining nutrition. These subtle solutions, often passed orally or recorded in shorthand, represented centuries of trial and error, adaptation, and quiet experimentation. You might realize that the work of the kitchen, while uncelebrated, preserved not only life but knowledge. Practical, culinary, and observational wisdom accumulated slowly, often invisible to outsiders. Even the smallest tasks carried significance. Cleaning floors and utensils, tending fires, mending storage containers, and carefully measuring rations were acts of endurance that sustained the entire community. The invisible labor of the kitchen allowed monks in the scriptorium, infirmary, and cloisters to continue their work, unburdened by hunger or contamination. You might reflect that the survival of knowledge, spiritual practice, and communal life depended on these quiet, meticulous routines. Yet despite careful planning and innovation, uncertainty remained. Weather could ruin harvests, pests could overwhelm granaries, and sudden illness could strain supplies. You understood that life in the monastery was a continuous negotiation with scarcity, requiring constant vigilance, adaptability, and resilience. The work demanded both skill and humility. Even the most careful preparation could not guarantee success, and every action was balanced against both immediate need and future survival. As night fell, the kitchen became a place of quiet reflection. You observed the empty hearths and stored supplies, realizing that the monks' labor had sustained life through diligence, ingenuity, and endurance. Each loaf, each ration, each preserved herb was a testament to the persistent, often unrecognized work that underpinned the monastery's survival. You understood that ordinary labor repeated endlessly, often without recognition, was as vital as prayer, scholarship, or spiritual discipline. And yet, as you extinguished the last embers and prepared to leave, one thought lingered. How many lessons, discoveries, and insights were lost to time, disappearing with the monks who labored silently in the kitchen? How much knowledge about survival, scarcity, and human resilience was preserved only in the fleeting memory of those who endured hunger, monotony, and danger behind stone walls? Reflection. The hidden kitchens of the monastery were crucibles of endurance, ingenuity, and survival. Behind the smoke, fire, and repeated labor lay the quiet persistence that sustained life, knowledge, and devotion. The monks who labored in obscurity remind us that much of human history, the continuity of communities, the preservation of knowledge, and the triumph over scarcity depends on the uncelebrated, repetitive work of ordinary people. Their perseverance, though invisible, left an indelible mark on both life and history. Story 5. The Silent Scriptorium, copying manuscripts until your eyes failed. The scriptorium was a room of stillness, of disciplined concentration so complete that the faintest sound, the scratch of a quill, the shuffle of parchment carried across the stone walls. You would enter and immediately sense the tension. Here, centuries of human knowledge were being reproduced, line by line in painstaking silence. Every monk had a seat, a table, and a small lamp. Every manuscript required attention, patience, and endurance. The work was monotonous, repetitive, and yet vital. Each day began with preparation. Parchments carefully cut, ink mixed from soot or oak galls, quills trimmed for optimal writing. The process demanded precision. Too much ink would blot the page, too little would fade, requiring laborious corrections. You learned to steady your hand, to measure pressure and speed, to track letters across centuries-old margins. Even minor errors could render a manuscript less legible, less accurate, and less valuable. In some cases, errors propagated across copies, silently altering the knowledge passed to future generations. Monks worked under strict hierarchy. Senior scribes oversaw the quality of the work, guiding novices with quiet correction and subtle instruction. Mistakes were met with patience, but also vigilance. You could not rely solely on memory or speed. Accuracy was paramount, and repetition was essential. You might have spent hours copying the same passage, line by line, until muscle memory and careful observation became inseparable. The labor was meditative, exhausting, and invisible to the outside world. The monotony was compounded by physical strain. Eyes ached under dim candlelight, hands cramped from hours of gripping quills, and the repetitive motions of writing led to stiffness and fatigue. Some monks developed permanent tremors or joint pain, yet the work continued unabated. You understood that endurance was not just a virtue, it was a necessity. Each letter preserved knowledge. Each completed page was a safeguard against forgetfulness, decay, or destruction. But beyond preservation, creativity and subtle judgment were required. Decisions about abbreviations, spacing, ornamentation, and punctuation fell to the scribe. Each choice reflected skill, taste, and awareness of the manuscript's audience. A single illuminated letter, delicately painted in gold or red, required hours of focus, precision, and repeated effort. Even the most ordinary manuscripts demanded care. Copying a psalm, a treatise on medicine, or a historical chronicle was never purely mechanical. You realized that the scriptorium was a space where endurance, artistry, and intellectual labor intersected. Silence dominated the scriptorium, punctuated only by occasional whispered instructions or the soft scratching of quills. This stillness, while oppressive to some, cultivated intense focus. Monks internalized both the rhythm of their own labor and that of others. You learned to pace yourself, alternating attention between line and margin, inkpot and parchment, so that mistakes were minimized. Repetition became both protection and ritual, a way to ensure continuity while training the body and mind to endure long hours of monotonous labor. The scriptorium was not immune to accidents. Ink spilled, quills splintered, parchment tore, and errors crept in despite the monk's best efforts. Each incident required correction, scraping the ink with a knife, applying careful blotting, or in extreme cases, starting an entire page anew. Such setbacks were minor in the broader scope of work, yet they reinforced vigilance, patience, and the understanding that knowledge required constant care and attention. Beyond technical skill, moral and spiritual discipline governed the work. The copying of texts was considered both an act of devotion and a service to humanity. Monks prayed silently while writing, seeking divine guidance to preserve the knowledge accurately. The act of transcription was therefore both practical and spiritual, linking the physical endurance of hands and eyes to the devotion of the heart. You might notice the same monk pausing mid-line, quill poised, murmuring a prayer before resuming a quiet acknowledgement of the sacred responsibility entrusted to him. The work could also be isolating. Days stretched into weeks, with few interactions outside whispered instructions or the occasional review by a senior scribe. Yet this solitude cultivated focus and introspection. You became intimately familiar with the texts themselves, the rhythms of psalms, the structure of chronicles, the meticulous details of scientific, medical, or philosophical works. Each manuscript became both a physical object and a map of human thought, painstakingly preserved for future generations. And yet, as you adjusted your quill and glanced over the nearly finished page, one thought lingered. For all the care, accuracy, and devotion invested, how many manuscripts would survive? How many errors, minor, unnoticed, or cumulative, would alter knowledge unknowingly? How much of the human effort invested in the scriptorium would vanish, leaving only fragments or shadows for future scholars to decipher? In the quiet stillness of the scriptorium, you realize the essential truth: the preservation of knowledge, the endurance of human thought, and the continuity of culture rested on invisible, repetitive labor performed in near silence, under conditions of strain, fatigue, and intense focus. Each manuscript, each letter, was a testament to human perseverance, the quiet shaping of history through patience, skill, and devotion. A question lingered as you lowered your quill. In a world so reliant on endurance and repetition, how many discoveries, ideas, or knowledge were lost simply because the monk's hand faltered, the ink blotted, or the manuscript decayed before it could be preserved? By mid-morning, the scriptorium had settled into its characteristic rhythm: the scratch of quills on parchment, the soft whisper of instructions, and the occasional clatter of dropping pots. The silence, while imposing, allowed for intense focus. You quickly understood that every moment of inattention could compromise the painstaking labor of hours or even days. Each monk's endurance was tested not only by the physical strain of writing, but by the relentless mental demand of preserving accuracy. Mistakes were a constant hazard. An errant stroke could change a word, shift a meaning, or render a passage nearly illegible. In some cases, errors propagated. A single mistake in a copied chronicle could subtly distort historical events, while miscopied medical texts could alter treatments in ways no one could immediately detect. You realized that accuracy was not merely a virtue, it was a safeguard against the slow erosion of knowledge over generations. Every quill stroke carried the weight of both present labor and future understanding. Eye strain was a near-universal affliction. By candlelight, parchment's pale surface reflected every shadow, making it difficult to maintain clarity over hours of work. Monks squinted, leaned close, and shifted positions repeatedly, balancing comfort against the risk of mistakes. Some developed permanent vision issues, while others experienced migraines and fatigue that dulled both judgment and motor precision. You might imagine the monotony of tracing the same letters repeatedly, hour after hour, until the hand moved almost independently, guided by rhythm more than conscious thought. Hierarchy shaped every aspect of the scriptorium. Senior scribes oversaw the production of manuscripts, corrected errors, and silently assessed the skill of novices. Mistakes were met with quiet correction rather than overt punishment, though repeated carelessness could result in reassignment or extended periods of menial labor. You would notice that the guidance was subtle: a corrected margin, a whispered instruction, a demonstration of an illuminated letter, all part of a slow apprenticeship that demanded patience and meticulous observation. The work was physically demanding. Quills needed constant trimming, ink required frequent mixing, and parchment had to be carefully prepared to avoid tearing. Even the act of dipping a quill could spill ink, blotting hours of work in seconds. These small accidents were frustrating, yet they also trained focus and caution. You quickly learned that survival in the scriptorium depended on rhythm, repetition, and vigilance. Monotony became protective. By following established routines precisely, errors were minimized and the pace sustained over long hours. But monotony was not merely mechanical. Creativity and subtle judgment were essential. Decisions about abbreviation, spacing, and layout affected readability, while decorative elements like illuminated initials required intense skill and patience. Some monks experimented quietly, adjusting techniques or blending pigments in ways that improved the manuscript's durability or clarity. These innovations, often unrecorded, contributed to the survival of knowledge and reflected a delicate balance between tradition and individual insight. Fatigue, isolation, and repetitive labor exerted a psychological toll. Monks worked in near silence, observing each other's concentration, learning through mimicry, and internalizing the rhythm of shared labor. Even short distractions and errant noise, a cough or a tremor in the hand could propagate mistakes, reminding you that precision was fragile. Endurance was both physical and mental, sustained through meditation, prayer, and sheer repetition of practiced motions. Hidden knowledge thrived in this environment. Marginal notes, shorthand symbols, and corrections allowed ideas to survive beyond the immediate scribe. Some insights methods for mixing pigments, constructing ink, or interpreting complex texts were preserved only in practice or memory. You might realize that the most valuable contributions were often invisible. A subtle correction here, a more legible copy there, ensuring that information endured despite the fragility of materials and human fallibility. Errors, however, were unavoidable. Even the most careful monk could miswrite a letter or misinterpret a word. You learned that survival of knowledge was contingent not only on skill, but on redundancy, multiple copies, careful cross-checking, and the slow accumulation of incremental improvements. This laborious repetition ensured that even if one manuscript failed, another might survive to convey the same ideas to future generations. And yet, for all the diligence, questions lingered. How many texts were lost because a scribe fell ill, a parchment decayed, or ink failed? How many discoveries, insights, or historical accounts disappeared before they could be preserved? The scriptorium, though seemingly static and monotonous, was a battlefield against time, error, and entropy, a place where human endurance determined the survival of knowledge itself. By the end of the day, as the candles burned low and the last quills were cleaned, you understood the essential truth. The scriptorium was more than a room of copying, it was a crucible of human perseverance, a place where patience, skill, and devotion intersected to preserve the fragile continuity of civilization. Each manuscript carried the imprint of human labor, the weight of centuries, and the quiet determination to endure against loss, decay, and the relentless passage of time. And one thought lingered as you closed the covers of the day's work. In a world so reliant on repetition, vigilance, and endurance, how many ideas, insights, or lessons were lost simply because the monk's hand faltered, the ink ran dry, or the parchment failed? As evening descended on the monastery, the scriptorium grew quieter still. Candles flickered against stone walls, casting long shadows over rows of manuscripts. You paused to examine a nearly completed folio, each letter traced with care, each margin annotated, every stroke of ink reflecting hours, perhaps days, of labor. The room seemed suspended in time, a silent testimony to human perseverance, endurance, and the relentless commitment to preserving knowledge. The work of the scriptorium was far more than transcription. It was preservation against both decay and oblivion. Parchment was fragile, ink could fade, and centuries of human error or natural disaster could erase entire traditions. Each monk understood this, though often silently, and worked with an awareness that their efforts were part of a chain stretching across generations. One miscopied line, one overlooked error, could propagate through history, subtly altering the transmission of knowledge. The responsibility weighed heavily, yet it was accepted as sacred labor. Physical strain was omnipresent. Eyes ached from dim light, fingers cramped from hours of gripping quills, and shoulders stiffened from long hours of leaning over tables. Some monks developed chronic pain or vision issues that limited their longevity as scribes. And yet, the rhythm of repetition carried its own protection. Muscle memory, careful observation, and incremental adaptation allowed the work to continue, even as fatigue threatened focus. Endurance was both a tool and a discipline, shaping not only the manuscripts but the monks themselves. Errors were inevitable, but the system of redundancy mitigated their consequences. Multiple copies of the same text were produced, cross-checked, and sometimes corrected against earlier versions. This painstaking process created a form of collective memory, where knowledge could survive even if individual pages were lost, damaged, or miscopied. You began to see the scriptorium as both a laboratory and a safeguard, an ecosystem in which human effort, patience, and subtle ingenuity ensured continuity across generations. Yet beyond the technical demands lay an ethical and spiritual dimension. Copying texts was not merely practical, it was a devotional act. Each manuscript preserved not only secular knowledge, but sacred writings, philosophical treatises, and medical texts. The monks' hands carried responsibility for the survival of civilization itself, translating centuries of human thought into a form resilient to time. You could imagine them whispering prayers, pausing midline to reflect on the weight of their task, understanding that endurance and accuracy were intertwined with devotion. Hidden knowledge thrived in subtle ways. Marginalia, shorthand annotations, and experimental methods such as new ink formulations or corrections of ambiguous phrases ensured that insight persisted beyond individual lifetimes. Some of these innovations would be rediscovered centuries later, forming the backbone of modern scholarship. Yet many remained unseen, preserved only in memory, quietly shaping the survival of ideas in ways invisible to casual observers. Fatigue, monotony, and isolation were constant companions. Hours stretched into days, weeks, and months, with little variation in the repetitive labor of copying. Yet within this repetition lay subtle victories: a perfectly illuminated letter, a text free of errors, or a manuscript that would survive centuries. These triumphs were quiet, almost invisible, yet monumental in their impact. They reinforced the understanding that progress and preservation often depend on small, repetitive, uncelebrated acts of skill and endurance. The psychological toll was undeniable. Monks faced endless repetition, physical discomfort, and isolation from the broader world. Yet the discipline cultivated patience, observation, and an intimate connection to the knowledge they preserved. Each page, painstakingly copied, reflected both human limitation and human perseverance. You realized that the scriptorium was a space where ordinary labor became extraordinary by its cumulative effect. Generations of effort, repetition, and vigilance shaping the survival of civilization itself. As you finally laid down your quill and surveyed the rows of completed manuscripts, one thought lingered. Much of human knowledge rests not on discovery alone, but on preservation. The survival of texts, ideas, and culture depended on repetitive labor, careful observation, and the quiet endurance of countless monks whose names have been lost to history. Their work reminds you that continuity, memory, and civilization often rely on invisible hands, meticulous repetition, and the courage to persist through monotony, fatigue, and error. And the question remained, echoing softly in the quiet scriptorium: how many ideas, insights, or innovations were preserved by chance, perseverance, and repetition, and how many were lost forever because a hand faltered, ink ran dry, or parchment decayed before it could be safeguarded? Reflection: the scriptorium illustrates the unseen labor that sustains human knowledge. Its monks remind us that endurance, attention to detail, and the quiet repetition of small acts are as crucial to history as invention or discovery. Civilization relies not only on ideas, but on the invisible, painstaking work that preserves them for generations to come. Story 6. The Cloistered Garden: Healing, Prayer, and Secrets of the Soil. You step into the cloistered garden, a space of calm bounded by stone walls and narrow walkways. The air carries a subtle fragrance. Mint, sage, thyme, and other medicinal herbs mingle with the earthy scent of tilled soil. At first glance, the garden seems serene, almost decorative, but beneath its orderly rows lies a complex ecosystem, cultivated with care, patience, and quiet devotion. It is here that the monastery sustains life, preserves knowledge, and nurtures both body and spirit. Gardens were central to monastic survival. Monks grew vegetables, grains, fruits, and especially medicinal herbs that supported the infirmary and daily diet. You might begin your day at dawn, hoe in hand, checking for weeds, pests, and the subtle signs of disease in leaves or stems. Even minor oversights, a neglected row of herbs, a patch of wilted vegetables could threaten the monastery's supply of medicine and food. Every action in the garden, no matter how repetitive or mundane, carried consequences that extended beyond the soil. Herbal knowledge was meticulously preserved and applied. Plants were chosen not only for nutrition but for their medicinal properties. Sage for digestive ailments, chamomile for calming the sick, lavender for fevers, and thyme for wound care. You learned to harvest carefully, timing collection to maximize potency. Leaves, flowers, and roots were dried, stored, or prepared as tinctures, poultices, or teas. The labor required precision, attention, and patience. Too early or too late, and the remedy could be weakened or spoiled. The garden demanded physical endurance. Digging, planting, weeding, and watering were repetitive tasks performed under the sun, rain, or biting cold. Hands became calloused, backs stiffened, and muscles ached from bending over rows for hours. You quickly realized that this labor, while physically demanding, was inseparable from monastic discipline. Patience, perseverance, and devotion were cultivated alongside the plants themselves. Observation was as important as labor. Monks monitored soil conditions, weather patterns, and plant health, learning to recognize subtle shifts in growth, color, or texture. Pests, rabbits, insects, and small rodents required constant vigilance. Protective measures were simple yet effective: woven fences, careful placement of plants, or companion planting to repel harmful insects. You might note the intricate systems of planting, irrigation, and crop rotation that preserved both soil and yield, reflecting a deep understanding of ecological balance, long before modern science articulated it. Beyond practical labor, the garden was a space for meditation and prayer. Tasks were repetitive, yet the rhythm allowed the mind to wander, reflect, or connect with the divine. While pulling weeds or watering herbs, monks recited psalms or silently contemplated scripture. Labor and devotion were intertwined. The physical act of tending the garden was itself a form of spiritual practice, blending utility with faith. Hierarchy influenced both labor and knowledge. Senior gardeners guided novices, demonstrating techniques, correcting mistakes, and sharing subtle insights about plant growth, herbal potency, and seasonal rhythms. Mistakes were inevitable: misidentifying a plant, overwatering a bed, or failing to notice early signs of disease, but each error became a lesson, recorded in memory, marginal notes, or quietly taught to future apprentices. Knowledge was cumulative, preserved through repetition and careful observation. The garden also served as a laboratory for experimentation. Monks tried new planting arrangements, tested combinations of herbs, and observed growth patterns. Some discovered unexpected uses: flowers that healed cuts, roots that aided digestion, or plants that could be dried and stored for months without losing potency. Many innovations were subtle, quietly noted in manuscripts or oral instruction, contributing to the monastery's enduring expertise. Survival depended on careful planning. Seasonal cycles dictated planting schedules, harvest timing, and preservation strategies. Failure to anticipate frost, drought, or pest infestation could reduce the yield, compromising both nutrition and medicine. Every decision, from which plants to sow to how to store harvested herbs, carried tangible consequences. You understood that the garden was both a source of sustenance and a silent teacher of vigilance, foresight, and patience. Even the smallest details mattered. Rows had to be straight, paths kept clear, and water distributed evenly. Each plant was monitored, each soil patch tended, as though the success of the monastery itself depended on meticulous care. And in many ways it did. The garden fed the body, supported the infirmary, and shaped the rhythm of monastic life. Yet as the day wore on, a subtle tension persisted. Despite careful labor, some crops would fail, herbs might lose potency, and pests could circumvent even the most attentive defenses. You realized that human effort, no matter how disciplined, could not fully control nature. The garden demanded endurance, observation, and humility, the acknowledgement that life was fragile, knowledge was tentative, and survival required constant vigilance. A thought lingered as you stepped back from the garden, wiping soil from your hands. In a world where the smallest details of labor determined life, how much practical knowledge, observation, and innovation was preserved silently in gardens like these, and how many secrets of survival were lost with those who labored in obscurity. By mid-morning, the cloistered garden was alive with careful, deliberate activity. Monks moved methodically among the rows of vegetables, herbs, and flowers, hands calloused from repetitive labor. The work demanded endurance, precision, and constant attention to detail. Every weed pulled, every seed sown, every leaf harvested was part of an intricate balance, sustaining life, health, and the monastery's continuity. Observation was at the heart of gardening. You learned to note subtle shifts in soil color, moisture, and texture, to detect early signs of blight or pest infestation, and to recognize the minute variations in leaves, stems, and flowers that indicated a plant's vitality. Rabbits or insects could devastate a crop if unnoticed. Drought could weaken plants despite careful watering. Each observation guided your labor, demanding patience and mindfulness. Survival depended on seeing what was often imperceptible to the casual eye. Pest management required both ingenuity and persistence. Monks devised simple yet effective methods: fences to keep rabbits away, companion planting to deter insects, or physical removal of harmful larvae. These measures demanded repetition and attentiveness, as even a brief lapse could allow pests to multiply, threatening the monastery's supply of food and medicine. You realized that gardening was as much about vigilance as cultivation. Success was determined not solely by skill, but by consistency and endurance. Herbal medicine added layers of complexity. Plants were grown for specific remedies: chamomile for fevers, sage for digestion, thyme for antiseptic poultices. Harvesting required precise timing. Leaves picked too early or too late might lose potency. Drying, storing, and preparing the herbs were labor-intensive processes, demanding careful attention to preserve medicinal properties. You understood that the garden was not just a source of nutrition, but also a living pharmacy, and that the monk's expertise bridged the gap between nature and healing. The repetitive labor of the garden shaped both skill and character. Kneeling in rows, pulling weeds, or watering beds for hours developed patience and endurance. Monks internalized rhythms of work, observation, and prayer, combining physical labor with spiritual reflection. Even the monotony had purpose. Each repetition reinforced techniques, sharpened attention, and prepared the gardener for challenges both immediate and unforeseen. Yet the garden was also a space for quiet experimentation. Monks tested new planting arrangements, crop rotations, and herbal combinations. Some discovered methods to extend the shelf life of harvested plants or to maximize potency for medicinal use. These innovations were often subtle, passed down orally or recorded in marginal notes. Even minor discoveries: an herb thriving in a shaded spot, a combination that repelled pests, could have significant impacts on survival and healing. The garden was a laboratory as much as a source of sustenance. Seasonal cycles dictated labor and strategy. Early spring demanded preparation of soil and sowing of seeds. Summer required weeding, watering, and pest vigilance. Autumn focused on harvesting and preservation. Winter demanded careful storage and planning for scarcity. Every action was linked to a timeline of survival, and errors could have lasting consequences. You might spend days nurturing seedlings only to see them fail from frost, disease, or overlooked pests. The work cultivated both humility and foresight, teaching lessons that extended far beyond the garden beds. Hierarchy structured knowledge and labor. Senior gardeners guided novices, teaching techniques for planting, harvesting, and preparing medicinal herbs. Mistakes were corrected gently, and insights were transmitted through observation and hands-on instruction. You might notice a senior monk demonstrating how to dry a delicate flower without losing its potency, or showing subtle differences in leaf color that indicated readiness for harvest. Knowledge in the garden was cumulative, preserved through meticulous labor, observation, and apprenticeship. Even with careful planning, uncertainty persisted. Nature was unpredictable. Weather, pests, and disease could undo weeks of effort. You learned that survival depended not on control, but on vigilance, adaptability, and repetition. The garden demanded endurance, not just of body, but of mind. Every harvest, every preserved herb, every successful experiment was a quiet triumph over uncertainty. As the day progressed and shadows lengthened, the garden quieted. You paused to survey the rows of thriving herbs and vegetables, the carefully mulched beds, and the paths cleared of weeds. The fruits of labor, observation, and ingenuity were tangible yet fragile. You understood that the survival of the monastery depended on these hidden acts of care, often unrecognized but absolutely essential. A thought lingered as you wiped soil from your hands. How many techniques, experiments, and observations developed over generations survived only in memory or marginal notes, quietly shaping both monastic medicine and daily survival, while countless lessons were lost to time, decay, or obscurity. As evening descended, the cloistered garden exhaled a deep calm. Rows of vegetables, medicinal herbs, and carefully tended flowers glowed softly in the waning light, their shapes and colors a testament to months of repetitive labor, observation, and subtle experimentation. You walked along the paths, noticing the delicate leaves of sage, the fragrant clusters of thyme, and the robust stems of cabbage, each one reflecting the care of countless hands over countless hours. Here, survival, knowledge, and devotion were inseparable. The harvest was both laborious and delicate. Herbs had to be gathered at precise moments to maximize their potency. Vegetables required careful handling to avoid bruising or spoilage. Roots were dug, cleaned, and stored to sustain the community through winter. Every act was a product of patience and accumulated experience. A misstep harvesting too early, misplacing a batch, or allowing spoilage could diminish the monastery's food or medicine supply. The stakes were quiet yet profound. Human lives depended on the diligence of these seemingly mundane tasks. You realized that the garden was a living repository of knowledge. Each plant represented centuries of observation, experimentation, and practical insight. Monks noted subtle variations in soil, sunlight, and moisture. They experimented with planting arrangements, irrigation methods, and companion planting to repel pests naturally. These innovations were rarely celebrated, yet they had long-lasting consequences. A minor discovery about crop rotation or herb potency could improve survival for generations. Knowledge persisted quietly, encoded in marginal notes, oral instruction, and the living plants themselves. Endurance defined both the labor and the gardener. Kneeling for hours, bending over rows of soil, and performing repetitive tasks while observing each plant's condition demanded physical and mental stamina. The repetitive motions became meditative, rhythmically reinforcing skill, awareness, and patience. You understood that survival depended not only on labor but on continuity. The same hands, performing the same tasks, day after day, maintained life, healing, and knowledge across decades. Even mistakes became lessons. Some plants failed despite careful tending. Weather could ruin a season's harvest. Pests occasionally breached defenses. Each setback taught observation, adjustment, and planning. Monks learned to anticipate failure, develop contingency strategies, and adapt their techniques. The garden trained resilience as much as it produced food, emphasizing that survival depended on awareness, flexibility, and careful repetition over time. Spiritual discipline intertwined with labor. Tending the garden was a form of prayer, hands in soil, eyes observing carefully, mind reflecting quietly. Each seed sown, each weed removed, and each plant harvested became an act of devotion, linking survival with spirituality. You might notice monks pausing mid-task to recite a psalm, whispering a prayer over the herbs, or reflecting silently on the intricate balance of life. Labor and faith were inseparable, each reinforcing the other. Hierarchy guided both knowledge and practice. Senior gardeners instructed novices, correcting errors, demonstrating techniques, and passing down practical wisdom. The garden was a classroom as much as a source of sustenance. Each season produced not only crops but apprentices skilled in observation, experimentation, and endurance. The hidden work of training, observation, and mentorship ensured that both food and knowledge survived the uncertainties of time and environment. Even the simplest tasks carried significance. Watering a bed, mulching soil, or pruning a plant became an act of stewardship, sustaining life and ensuring continuity. The cumulative effect of these small, often repetitive actions shaped the health, survival, and resilience of the monastery. You realize that much of human history depends on this invisible labor, quiet, patient, and enduring, far removed from fame or recognition. As night fell and shadows lengthened, you considered the legacy of the cloistered garden. It was not only a source of nourishment and medicine, but a living archive of observation, adaptation, and endurance. The knowledge preserved here how to cultivate plants, recognize their medicinal properties, and ensure survival was quietly transformative, passed down from monk to monk, generation to generation. Many innovations would eventually influence wider practices, yet much remained hidden, recorded only in memory, marginalia, and the living soil. A final question lingered as you stepped from the garden into the silent corridors. How many secrets of survival, ingenuity, and human endurance remained buried in the soil of monasteries, unnoticed by history, yet quietly sustaining communities for centuries? Reflection. The cloistered garden exemplifies the unseen labor, observation, and endurance that underpin human survival and knowledge. Its monks remind us that continuity, whether in food, medicine, or wisdom, depends not on grand gestures, but on patience, careful repetition, and devotion sustained over time. Even the quietest acts of care can ripple across generations, shaping history in ways often invisible but profoundly enduring. Story 7. Bells, Silence, and the Rhythm of Monastic Life. You wake before dawn to the faint echo of the monastery bell, its deep toll vibrating through the cold stone corridors. Time in the monastery is measured not by hours on a clock, but by bells, rituals, and the meticulous division of the day. The ringing marks more than moments. It governs labor, prayer, meals, and rest. You quickly learn that every sound, every pause, and every silence carries meaning, shaping both the body and mind. Life within the monastery is structured around the canonical hours. Matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline divide the day, demanding precise attendance and unwavering discipline. Each hour is punctuated by bells that echo across cloisters, dormitories, and refectories. You might walk to the chapel, still shrouded in pre-dawn darkness, to join fellow monks in chants that have endured for centuries. The repetition is both soothing and exacting, establishing a rhythm that dictates every subsequent task. Silence dominates outside the chapel. Conversation is limited. Gestures and written notes convey instructions. In the scriptorium, infirmary, or kitchen, this silence fosters concentration and reflection. Yet it is never empty. It is charged with the discipline of observation, awareness of communal rules, and attention to the unseen details of daily life. You might notice how even small noises, a creaking door, a dropped tool, are met with immediate stillness, an instinctive recognition of communal order. The bells themselves are more than timekeepers. They are instruments of coordination and discipline. Each toll signals the transition from one activity to another: prayer, labor, study, or rest. You quickly learn to anticipate the cadence of monastic life, understanding that missed or delayed responses disrupt not only your routine, but the rhythm of the entire community. Every action, however mundane, is synchronized to the tolling of bells, reinforcing a collective consciousness grounded in structure, repetition, and endurance. Meals are conducted in silence, marked by a bell and governed by ritual. In the refectory, you sit with others, listening to readings from scripture or hagiography while eating simple fare. Even nourishment is regimented. Portions are prescribed, manners observed, and gratitude silently expressed. You recognize that the discipline of the table extends beyond physical sustenance, shaping patience, humility, and attention to order. The rhythm of labor mirrors the rhythm of prayer. Work in the kitchen, garden, or scriptorium begins and ends according to bells. Tasks are divided, repeated, and closely observed. You might spend hours chopping vegetables, copying texts, or weeding beds, with the bell reminding you to pause, shift tasks, or join communal prayer. The integration of sound, labor, and devotion creates a pervasive structure, embedding discipline into both mind and body. Sleep is likewise structured. Monks retire shortly after compline, rising in the early hours for matins. Even rest is framed by communal expectation, requiring careful attention to timing, posture, and readiness for the next toll. You understand that the monk's day is a cycle. Sound and silence, labor and prayer, wakefulness, and rest all interwoven into a continuous rhythm that shapes endurance, reflection, and communal cohesion. Silence carries moral and psychological weight. In the absence of conversation, you become attuned to subtle cues: the shifting of a candle, the sound of a quill on parchment, the faint rustle of robes. Observation and mindfulness are cultivated through this enforced quiet, reinforcing vigilance and awareness. You notice how small deviations, a whispered comment, a delayed response can disrupt not only workflow but the mental equilibrium of the cloistered community. The monotony of routine is both demanding and protective. By repeating the same cycles, bells, labor, meals, prayer, you internalize structure, discipline, and endurance. You notice how attention becomes sharper, reflexes more precise, and awareness of both environment and task heightened. Life in the monastery is defined not by excitement but by careful management of time, energy, and focus. Yet even in its strict repetition, the rhythm is flexible enough to allow subtle observation and reflection. You might pause during a long vigil to notice the interplay of shadow and candlelight, the scent of incense, or the harmony of chants. These small, often unnoticed moments reveal that structure and monotony are not merely constraints, they are frameworks for mindfulness, endurance, and understanding. And as the day progresses, a question lingers. In a life governed so strictly by bells, silence, and repetition, how much creativity, observation, and subtle insight is cultivated quietly, invisible to outsiders, yet crucial to the survival, spiritual growth, and cohesion of the monastic community? By mid-morning, the monastery hums with quiet activity, synchronized to the tolling of bells. Each sound delineates a transition: prayer, labor, study, or rest. You notice how this structured rhythm shapes both body and mind. Endurance is cultivated not only through physical tasks but through repetition, attention, and mindfulness. Every monk, novice, or elder becomes acutely attuned to both the environment and the community, learning to anticipate movements, respect silence, and respond with precision. The labor itself is repetitive yet demanding. Tasks in the kitchen, garden, or scriptorium are timed and divided according to the canonical hours. You might spend hours kneading dough, copying manuscripts, or tending herbs, each motion embedded in the monastery's rhythm. Repetition becomes a teacher. Hands learn the work as the mind observes minute details, shapes of leaves, inconsistencies in parchment, or changes in the consistency of dough. Even mundane labor is elevated by observation, patience, and subtle adaptation. Silence, pervasive throughout the monastery, cultivates acute awareness. You quickly notice the smallest sounds: a quill scratching a page, the shuffle of sandals, or the faint hum of a candle flame. These cues provide information about the pace and state of work across the cloisters. Vigilance becomes natural. You learn to act without verbal instruction, understanding that your role is part of a larger, coordinated effort. In this environment, observation and endurance are inseparable from routine. The bells structure more than work, they structure thought and reflection. During hours of silence, monks meditate, pray, and contemplate scripture. Each bell reminds you to pause, shift attention, or recalibrate effort. Over time, you realize that monotony and repetition are tools. They cultivate patience, train focus, and reinforce spiritual discipline. Even small deviations, a missed toll, delayed task, or inattentive gesture reveal the interconnectedness of every action and the subtle consequences of inattention. Hierarchy and mentorship guide both labor and spiritual growth. Senior monks ensure that novices follow the rhythms, correct errors, and internalize routines. You may observe a senior quietly adjusting a novice's posture, correcting a miscopied word, or demonstrating proper handling of food or tools. These small, often unnoticed interventions preserve both order and knowledge, embedding practical skills within a framework of discipline and reflection. The monotony also cultivates endurance in unexpected ways. Hours of repetitive labor scrubbing floors, tending the garden, copying texts train not only physical stamina, but also patience, attention, and mental resilience. You notice that prolonged engagement with routine sharpens perception. Small changes in materials, environment, or workflow are more easily detected, allowing monks to anticipate challenges and respond effectively. Survival in the monastery depends as much on observation and foresight as on physical strength or skill. Even prayer and meditation follow the rhythm of routine. Chants, readings, and silent reflection align with bells, reinforcing structure while allowing introspection. You may notice how repetition deepens comprehension. Lines of scripture become familiar, patterns of thought internalized, and spiritual insights crystallize through sustained attention. The integration of labor, prayer, and observation creates a holistic rhythm, embedding both practical and spiritual endurance. Yet monotony is never mindless. Subtle innovations, small improvements, and quiet insights are nurtured within repetition. A more efficient arrangement of tools in the kitchen, a novel method for preserving herbs, or an adjustment in manuscript copying might emerge quietly, unnoticed by all but the most attentive. You recognize that innovation often grows from the constraints of routine, emerging through careful observation and repeated practice rather than sudden inspiration. And still, uncertainty lingers. Bells dictate structure, but nature, scarcity, illness, and human error remain beyond control. You realize that the rhythm of monastic life is not a guarantee of perfection, but a framework for endurance, resilience, and continuity. Repetition and structure reduce chaos, train attention, and preserve knowledge and survival, yet the monks must remain alert to the unpredictable variables of daily life. As the day progresses and the final bell of none fades into the distance, one thought persists. In a life governed so strictly by bells, silence, and repetition, how much human insight, observation, and subtle ingenuity was quietly cultivated, hidden behind ritual and monotony, yet essential for the monastery's survival and the preservation of its knowledge. As evening settles across the monastery, the echo of the final bell fades into silence, leaving a profound stillness that both calms and structures the mind. You walk through the cloisters, observing the subtle ways the rhythm of the day has shaped each space and every monk's movement. The structure dictated by bells, labor, and prayer is more than order. It is a crucible for endurance, observation, and subtle human ingenuity. The rhythm of monastic life teaches persistence. Each day, hours are divided into precise segments: prayer, labor, study, and rest. Tasks are repetitive, demanding both physical and mental stamina. Yet through repetition, skills deepen. Hands grow steady in kneading dough or copying manuscripts. Eyes become attuned to minor variations in plants, parchment, or candlelight, and minds cultivate patience, focus, and resilience. You notice that continuity, rather than novelty, forms the backbone of monastic efficiency and survival. Silence reinforces both awareness and reflection. In the absence of unnecessary conversation, small details take on significance. You observe the faint scrape of a quill, the shuffle of sandals on stone, the whisper of robes across the floor. These details communicate information about timing, workflow, and shared attention. Vigilance becomes instinctive, and subtle patterns like a slight misalignment of pages or the early wilting of herbs are quickly noticed. The discipline of silence fosters a heightened capacity for observation, ensuring that labor and care are precise, coordinated, and effective. Monks also learn quiet innovation within structured repetition. The rigid timetable of bells and canonical hours might appear constraining, but it provides a framework in which subtle efficiencies or improvements can emerge. You might notice a slight adjustment in manuscript copying, a more effective rotation of garden crops, or a more balanced distribution of labor in the kitchen. Such innovations are rarely celebrated, yet they sustain survival and improve efficiency, proving that creativity often flourishes within constraint. Endurance is cultivated in body, mind, and spirit. Repetitive labor strengthens muscles, sharpens perception, and reinforces attention. Prayer and meditation, intertwined with routine, deepen focus and cultivate resilience. Each monk learns to synchronize with both the bell and the communal rhythm, internalizing structure until it guides action automatically. The monastery becomes a living system, in which continuity, repetition, and discipline preserve both life and knowledge across generations. Hierarchy and mentorship embed both skill and tradition. Senior monks guide novices through the cadence of life, teaching when to act, when to pause, and how to observe subtle signs of change in people, plants, or manuscripts. You realize that these lessons are rarely verbalized fully. Much of the learning occurs through observation, imitation, and repetition. Knowledge and survival are transmitted not in sudden revelations but through sustained, careful guidance and daily practice. The monotony of daily life, often mistaken for boredom, is actually a tool for cultivation. The repetition of tasks, whether chanting psalms, tending gardens, copying texts, or preparing meals, trains endurance and sharpens attention to detail. Every action becomes both an exercise in precision and a reflection of devotion. You might notice that even the smallest deviations, a misaligned page, a forgotten verse, or a neglected plant, reveal the fragility of survival and the importance of diligence. And yet, uncertainty remains. Bells structure the day, but they cannot control the elements, illness, scarcity, or human error. The monk's work, repetitive, disciplined, and meticulous, is a bulwark against chaos, but not a guarantee of perfection. Survival, knowledge, and continuity are achieved not through control, but through vigilance, endurance, and adaptability. You sense that the rhythm itself, more than any single action, is what sustains life and preserves wisdom. As night falls and the monastery quiets, one thought lingers: how much human ingenuity, observation, and subtle adaptation is hidden behind bells, silence, and repetition. How many lessons of endurance, mindfulness, and coordination were cultivated quietly, yet essential for survival, learning, and the preservation of knowledge across centuries. Reflection: the rhythm of monastic life, marked by bells, silence, and repetition, demonstrates how endurance, vigilance, and subtle ingenuity are cultivated through structure. The monks' lives remind us that continuity, survival, and knowledge often depend on patient, repeated effort rather than dramatic action. The lessons of the cloister endure, that discipline, attention, and persistence can quietly shape both individual growth and the survival of a community. Story 8: The Hidden Infirmary, Care, Disease, and the Monks Who Cured. You step through the unassuming wooden door of the monastery's infirmary, a space hidden behind stone walls and heavy curtains. The air is different here, damp, slightly pungent with herbs, and thick with the weight of suffering and labor. Few outsiders ever see this place. Yet inside, life and survival are maintained through patient attention, careful observation, and quiet endurance. The infirmary is a world of details, repetition, and subtle care, where the survival of the sick depends on labor often unseen and uncelebrated. The infirmary is organized meticulously. Each patient has a bed or pallet, simple but functional, arranged to maximize space and accessibility. Herbs, poultices, and tools are stored carefully, each labeled, dried, or prepared in advance. You quickly realize that survival in this space relies on both preparation and vigilance. Every tincture, bandage, and bowl must be available exactly when needed. Small errors using the wrong herb, miscalculating a dosage, or neglecting to clean a wound can have serious consequences. Disease is omnipresent. Monks contend with fevers, infections, malnutrition, and injuries sustained in labor or travel. Epidemics, from influenza to unknown fevers, sweep through communities with devastating efficiency. You notice that the infirmary is as much about containment as cure. Isolation of patients, careful cleaning of tools, and meticulous attention to hygiene rudimentary, though it may be by modern standards, prevent further spread. The work requires constant observation, patience, and a willingness to engage with discomfort and risk. Care is repetitive and demanding. Bandages must be changed, poultices applied, and herbal remedies administered at precise intervals. Monks record details of each patient's symptoms, responses to treatment, and observations of progression either orally or in written notes. The labor is tedious, physically exhausting, and emotionally taxing, yet necessary to preserve life. You begin to see that endurance is both a practical skill and a moral duty in this space. The sick depend on consistency, not heroics. Herbal knowledge is central to the infirmary's function. Remedies for fevers, digestive complaints, wounds, and respiratory illnesses are prepared from the garden or preserved supplies. Timing, dosage, and preparation methods are critical. Leaves must be harvested at the correct stage, roots properly dried, and mixtures carefully combined. You notice how observation over days, weeks, and even years informs treatment. Monks record subtle patterns, noting which herbs ease symptoms or accelerate recovery, creating an informal but sophisticated knowledge base. Hierarchy structures both labor and learning. Senior infirmarians guide novices, demonstrating techniques for wound care, preparation of remedies, and observation of symptoms. Mistakes are corrected gently but firmly, emphasizing accuracy and patience. Knowledge is transmitted through demonstration, repetition, and careful instruction, creating a continuity of care across generations. The survival of both patients and knowledge depends on this system of mentorship. The infirmary is also a place of quiet moral reflection. Monks confront illness, suffering, and mortality daily. Care is both practical and spiritual. Tending to wounds, administering remedies, and providing comfort through presence are seen as acts of devotion. You may notice a monk quietly holding the hand of a fevered patient, murmuring prayers while tending to bandages. The work requires emotional endurance as well as skill, blending compassion with discipline. Monitoring and record-keeping are meticulous. Symptoms, treatments, and outcomes are noted for each patient. Even small observations, changes in color, temperature, or behavior can indicate improvement or deterioration. You notice how repetition and careful attention compound into understanding. Subtle patterns are observed, remedies refined, and knowledge preserved for future patients. The invisible labor of tracking, observing, and adjusting is as critical as administering care itself. Despite preparation, uncertainty pervades the infirmary. Not every illness can be cured. Epidemics, complications, and limited resources mean that death is a frequent companion. Yet survival depends on vigilance, endurance, and incremental observation. A fever monitored, a wound cleaned, a poultice reapplied at the right moment. Life persists through these quiet, repeated actions, often unnoticed beyond the infirmary walls. And as you step back from the rows of beds, herbs, and meticulously recorded notes, one question lingers. In a space governed by patient observation, repeated care, and quiet endurance, how much knowledge, practice, and ingenuity was preserved through trial and error, and how many lessons of survival were lost when patients or monks passed away unseen. By mid-morning, the monastery's infirmary hums with quiet activity. Monks move carefully between beds, administering remedies, adjusting bandages, and observing subtle changes in their patients' conditions. Every movement is deliberate, Every action repeated daily reinforces skill, patience, and precision. You notice that survival here depends on the accumulation of small, meticulous observations rather than dramatic interventions. Observation is central. Monks monitor pulse, skin color, breathing, and behavior, noting even the smallest variations. A slight pallor, a subtle tremor, or a change in appetite can indicate improvement or decline. You see how repetition sharpens perception. The longer a monk works in the infirmary, the more attuned they become to subtle cues, allowing early detection of complications or the refinement of treatments. Knowledge is built through careful attention over time, quietly documented in notes or passed orally to novices. Preparation and timing are essential. Herbs, poultices, and remedies must be administered at precise intervals. Leaves picked too early or dried improperly may lose potency. Doses must be measured, mixed, and applied consistently. You realize that the physical endurance demanded by repetitive labor is mirrored by mental endurance. Staying alert, attentive, and precise across long hours is as crucial as the remedies themselves. Survival depends as much on consistency and vigilance as on any single cure. The infirmary also cultivates subtle innovation. Monks experiment cautiously, adjusting mixtures, combining herbs, or refining techniques based on observation. For example, they may notice that a specific herb alleviates fevers faster when prepared in a certain way, or that a combination of poultices prevents infection more reliably. These discoveries are rarely documented formally, but are quietly transmitted from mentor to apprentice, forming a living body of practical knowledge. Hierarchy and mentorship ensure continuity. Senior infirmarians guide novices in observation, treatment, and record-keeping. Errors are corrected gently yet firmly, reinforcing accuracy and precision. You notice that this system not only preserves techniques but cultivates patience, resilience, and discipline. Each monk learns that repetition, careful observation, and attention to detail are as critical to healing as knowledge of herbs or remedies. The work is emotionally demanding. Monks confront illness, suffering, and death daily. Yet their endurance, both physical and emotional, allows them to sustain care over long periods. Comforting patients, administering remedies, and maintaining cleanliness are acts of compassion intertwined with discipline. You see that emotional resilience is cultivated through repetition and reflection, with prayer providing both strength and structure. Sanitation and vigilance are essential for survival. The infirmary is cleaned meticulously, tools scrubbed, beds refreshed, floors swept. Pests and contamination must be controlled to prevent disease from spreading. You realize that even small lapses, a neglected surface, contaminated water, or improperly prepared remedy can have significant consequences. Survival is achieved not by luck but through sustained attention to detail and disciplined care. Monitoring and documentation reinforce the learning process. Every patient's symptoms, treatments, and responses are recorded, allowing patterns to emerge over weeks or months. You notice that this slow accumulation of data, often repetitive, tedious, and invisible, provides the foundation for medical knowledge within the monastery. It is through repetition, observation, and careful record-keeping that insights into illness, recovery, and effective remedies are preserved. Even in the face of uncertainty, endurance matters. Epidemics, sudden complications, or insufficient resources test both skill and patience. Monks must adapt, observing subtle changes, adjusting treatments, and maintaining vigilance. You see that the infirmary's success is rarely measured in dramatic recoveries, but in incremental improvements. A fever slightly reduced, a wound slowly healing, or a patient surviving when attention and care are sustained consistently. And as the day progresses, one thought lingers. In a space defined by observation, endurance, and repetition, how many medical insights were quietly preserved, passing from monk to monk, and how many were lost forever with patients who perished or practitioners who died without passing on their knowledge. As evening settles over the monastery, the infirmary quiets, yet its work continues invisibly in the careful rhythms of monitoring, preparation, and reflection. Beds are adjusted, herbs organized, and notes reviewed. You recognize that survival here is the product of patient repetition, subtle observation, and meticulous attention, a labor as invisible as it is vital. The health of the community depends not on heroic acts, but on sustained endurance and quiet diligence. Endurance defines every aspect of care. Monks spend long hours administering remedies, changing bandages, and monitoring patients, often under conditions of fatigue, stress, or illness themselves. Physical stamina is essential, yet mental and emotional endurance are equally critical. Observing subtle changes, making precise adjustments, and sustaining attention over extended periods require a discipline as rigorous as any manual labor. In the infirmary, survival depends on the capacity to persist, day after day, in service of others. Observation becomes expertise. Patterns of illness, responses to remedies, and subtle signs of deterioration are noted with care. Over time, repeated exposure to disease and recovery cultivates insight. You might notice a monk adjusting a poultice mixture slightly, observing that a patient's fever subsides more quickly, and quietly noting the result for future reference. Knowledge is built incrementally, often unrecognized by outsiders, yet it ensures that practical medical understanding endures across generations. The work of the infirmary is intertwined with spiritual discipline. Care is not only practical but devotional. Tending to the sick, preparing remedies, and offering comfort are acts of service and reflection. Prayer provides structure, emotional resilience, and moral grounding. You notice that devotion is inseparable from skill. Each act of care is both a practical intervention and a reflection of faith. Repetition reinforces not only technique, but the ethical and spiritual commitment behind it. Innovation, though subtle, is ever present. Small adjustments optimizing herb mixtures, refining preparation techniques, or improving hygiene practices accumulate over time, enhancing survival and care. These innovations are rarely documented formally, transmitted instead through mentorship, observation, and hands-on practice. You realize that much of what survives in monastic medical knowledge emerges quietly from repeated labor, careful attention, and incremental improvements. Hierarchy and mentorship ensure continuity. Senior infirmarians guide novices, demonstrating techniques, correcting mistakes, and transmitting knowledge orally or through repeated demonstration. You observe how the apprenticeship system cultivates not only skill but patience, vigilance, and resilience. Through careful repetition and supervision, knowledge and care persist even in the face of disease, scarcity, and uncertainty. Even the small victories are monumental. A patient's fever reduced, a wound healing, or a weakened body restored to basic strength may seem minor in isolation, yet cumulatively they sustain life and maintain community. You see that survival in the infirmary is less about dramatic cures than about consistent attention, observation, and perseverance over time. Life persists through repetition, endurance, and quiet care. The infirmary also teaches humility. Despite the best efforts, death is ever present. Not every illness can be cured, and not every intervention succeeds. You notice how monks accept these limits while continuing their work, learning from both successes and failures. Knowledge is built through patient observation of outcomes, and wisdom arises from recognizing patterns, limitations, and possibilities across repeated cycles of care. As night falls and the final rounds are completed, one thought lingers. In a space dominated by observation, patience, and repetition, how many insights into healing, endurance, and human resilience were preserved quietly, and how many were lost to the inevitable impermanence of life? The infirmary embodies the invisible labor that underpins survival, knowledge, and the human capacity to endure, reminding us that the most profound contributions often remain unseen. Reflection. The hidden infirmary demonstrates that survival, knowledge, and human resilience depend on endurance, observation, and quiet labor. Monks caring for the sick relied not on dramatic interventions, but on repetition, vigilance, and careful mentorship. Their work reminds us that the preservation of life and knowledge often depends on small, patient acts carried out consistently, shaping both history and human experience in ways that are profound, even if largely invisible. Story 9. Manuscript Margins, Secrets, Codes, and Forgotten Thoughts. You sit at a wooden desk in the dim light of the scriptorium, eyes scanning the surface of a newly copied manuscript. At first, it seems ordinary, carefully formed letters, consistent spacing, and meticulously aligned lines. But then your gaze shifts to the margins. There, in the narrow spaces between the text, you begin to notice subtle annotations, cryptic symbols, and tiny sketches. These marginalia are windows into the thoughts, experiments, and personal reflections of scribes long forgotten by history. Margins were often more than decorative space. They were sites of curiosity, observation, and experimentation. A scribe might record a correction, note an alternate spelling, or test a shorthand system. Some scribes added diagrams illustrating a concept in the text, while others inscribed personal reflections, prayers, frustrations, or fleeting observations about life in the monastery. These marginal notes provide an intimate glimpse into minds constrained by routine, yet searching for understanding, creativity, and self-expression. Errors in transcription, deliberate or accidental, were sometimes annotated in the margins. A scribe might notice that a line had been copied incorrectly and mark a subtle correction, often using symbols or abbreviations that only a fellow monk could interpret. You notice how these small interventions demonstrate both precision and humility. The manuscript is not static. It is a living object, shaped by repeated labor, observation, and reflection. Each marginal note preserves the memory of vigilance, awareness, and care. Some marginalia were cryptic codes or puzzles. Monks sometimes developed shorthand, symbolic systems, or coded references to obscure texts, intended to be understood only by those trained in specific knowledge. You may see the beginnings of ciphered notes hinting at medical remedies, theological interpretations, or practical guidance for copying difficult passages. These codes reveal a world of hidden intellectual labor, where observation, experimentation, and knowledge preservation intertwined. Marginal illustrations, though often small and seemingly decorative, served multiple purposes. Some were mnemonic devices, helping the scribe recall complex information. Others reflected whimsy, commentary, or visual experimentation with layout, proportion, and symmetry. You notice how a small sketch a cat curled up near the text, a peculiar pattern of interlaced letters, or an exaggerated human figure communicates personality, humor, or subtle critique. Even in a space governed by strict discipline, scribes found room for subtle creativity. The labor of annotation was painstaking. Margins were narrow, quills had to be maneuvered with precision, ink carefully controlled, and space managed thoughtfully. Errors could ruin the page, yet scribes persisted, demonstrating patience and skill honed through repetition. Every marginal note represents an investment of time, attention, and thought, a small act of personal imprint embedded within the collective labor of the manuscript. Margins also preserved knowledge that might otherwise be lost. Observations on remedies, agricultural techniques, or philosophical questions could be inscribed quietly, surviving only because a scribe took the time to record them. Over centuries, these marginal notes sometimes reveal practical insights that would otherwise have vanished with the author's lifetime. You realize that the survival of knowledge depended as much on these hidden observations as on the main text itself. The physical act of writing in margins required both dexterity and awareness. Scribes balanced ink flow, spacing, and legibility, often while seated for hours, bending over stone desks or under flickering candlelight. Their labor demanded endurance, patience, and precision, qualities mirrored in the content of their marginalia. Careful thought, subtle experimentation, and meticulous observation preserved in miniature. Even playful or personal notes reveal human resilience. A scribe recording a minor frustration, humorous anecdote, or fleeting emotional reaction reminds you that life in the monastery, though structured and repetitive, allowed moments of reflection, individuality, and emotional expression. Margins were a private space, a small window into personal experience, layered atop the collective labor of the community. And as you set down your quill and examine the margins closely, one question lingers. How much knowledge, experimentation, and human insight survives only in these overlooked spaces? And how many secrets, reflections, or innovations were lost when the margins remained empty or the pages decayed? By mid-morning in the scriptorium, your attention returns to the margins of countless manuscripts, where hidden knowledge, subtle experimentation, and personal reflection accumulate across centuries. These spaces, often overlooked, reveal the intellectual curiosity and practical ingenuity of scribes. You begin to understand that the manuscript is not merely a vessel for copying text, it is a living record of human thought, memory, and endurance. Many marginal notes serve as practical corrections or clarifications. Scribes would mark inconsistencies, provide alternate readings, or note errors inherited from earlier copies. You notice how these corrections are rarely dramatic but cumulatively critical. Each adjustment preserves the integrity of the text for future readers. The margins thus act as both safety net and memory archive, capturing the ongoing labor of accuracy, vigilance, and observation. Some marginalia are cryptic, intentionally coded, or symbolic. Monks might use shorthand, abbreviations, or personal symbols to annotate medical recipes, theological interpretations, or obscure references. These coded notes required attention, intelligence, and prior knowledge to decipher, creating a hidden network of understanding. You sense that margins were often used to transmit knowledge to select individuals, a subtle form of intellectual continuity amid the rigid communal discipline of monastic life. Marginal illustrations are equally revealing. While many appear decorative or whimsical, they serve practical, mnemonic, or experimental purposes. You notice small sketches representing concepts in the text, diagrams clarifying instructions, or playful annotations reflecting personality. Some scribes experimented with layout and proportion, testing how visual elements could aid memory, emphasize meaning, or enhance legibility. Even seemingly minor doodles thus carry functional, intellectual, and personal significance. Labor in the margins requires precision and endurance. Working in narrow spaces demands control over quill and ink, careful eye-hand coordination, and sustained focus under dim light. Mistakes are costly, as errors can obscure meaning or mar the manuscript. You notice that this repetitive, painstaking work cultivates patience, resilience, and attention to subtle detail qualities essential not only for manuscript production, but for the broader preservation of knowledge in the monastery. Margins preserve insights that might otherwise vanish. Notes on herbal remedies, agricultural observations, or philosophical reflections are tucked into the narrow spaces between lines, surviving centuries of use, neglect, and decay. You realize that the margins represent a secondary, parallel layer of history. While the main text conveys canonical knowledge, the annotations capture lived experience, experimentation, and practical ingenuity. They are evidence of human endurance, reflection, and quiet problem-solving. The act of annotating also fosters subtle creativity. Monks constrained by rigid rules of copying and layout could express individuality, humor, and intellectual curiosity in margins. A sarcastic remark, a clever visual pun, or a personal observation could coexist alongside devotional texts or scholarly work. You see how these hidden expressions reveal a human need for reflection, commentary, and connection, even within highly regulated spaces. Mentorship extends to marginalia as well. Senior scribes often guided novices in annotation, teaching them which observations were valuable, how to code notes effectively, and how to preserve clarity in limited space. This apprenticeship ensured that the knowledge embedded in margins' corrections, observations, experiments was transmitted carefully, preserving both skill and insight. Repetition and observation were key. Each generation of scribes refined methods, enhanced clarity, and continued the accumulation of practical knowledge. Yet uncertainty persists. Not every marginal note survives, and many insights were lost when pages decayed. Manuscripts were discarded, or scribes died without passing on their experience. You realize that human knowledge, painstakingly preserved in these margins, is fragile, surviving only through endurance, repetition, and careful attention across generations. Margins thus serve as both a testament to human ingenuity and a reminder of what is inevitably lost. And as you close the manuscript and examine the margins one last time, a lingering question arises. How many discoveries, insights, or personal reflections shaping medicine, philosophy, or daily life were quietly preserved here? And how many were erased by neglect, decay, or the passage of time? As evening descends over the scriptorium, the manuscripts rest on worn wooden desks, their pages faintly illuminated by candlelight. The main text appears complete and orderly, yet it is in the margins tiny, almost invisible, that a wealth of insight, experimentation, and reflection quietly persists. You begin to understand that these narrow spaces are more than decoration. They are repositories of observation, endurance, and creativity, preserving knowledge and human experience across centuries. The survival of knowledge depends on repetition and attention. Scribes copied texts carefully, ensuring accuracy, while simultaneously annotating margins with clarifications, corrections, or personal reflections. Each note, though small, represents an investment of attention and labor. You notice how repeated observation sharpens perception. Subtle inconsistencies are corrected, small discoveries are recorded, and practical insights are preserved. Over generations, these incremental contributions accumulate into a hidden archive of human ingenuity. Marginal codes, shorthand, and symbols reveal layers of intellectual experimentation. Some notes are personal medical recipes, practical instructions, or mnemonic devices intended to be understood by trained peers. Others are cryptic, serving as private reflections or secure transmission of sensitive knowledge. You realize that the margins create a dual narrative: the visible, canonical text and the hidden, experimental layer where scribes interact with knowledge, test ideas, and preserve observations for future learners. Visual marginalia also carries significance. Small sketches, diagrams, or symbols function as mnemonic aids, illustrative clarifications, or subtle commentary. A tiny drawing of a plant might correspond to a medicinal remedy. A geometric doodle could clarify a theological argument. A humorous figure might reflect the scribe's personality or observations of daily life. You notice that even playful or decorative elements serve practical, intellectual, or emotional purposes. These small acts of creativity quietly transform the manuscript into a living document. Mentorship ensures continuity. Senior scribes guide novices not only in copying texts, but also in observing and recording knowledge in margins. Techniques for clarity, notation, and experimentation are passed down through demonstration and repetition. You see how this apprenticeship fosters skill, patience, and attention to detail, allowing knowledge to persist even amid the routine demands of manuscript production. Survival of both knowledge and the text depends on this careful guidance. The labor of marginal annotation cultivates endurance. Repetitive tasks, writing, correcting, illustrating, require physical precision and mental vigilance. Mistakes can ruin a page, yet careful attention and repeated practice ensure accuracy and clarity. You realize that endurance is both practical and intellectual. The persistence of observation, correction, and reflection is what preserves insight for future generations. Yet uncertainty remains. Not every marginal note survives, and countless observations were lost to decay, neglect, or the death of scribes without heirs to their knowledge. You recognize that much of human ingenuity and daily insight exists quietly, preserved only through careful labor and repeated observation. The margins are a testament to both the fragility and persistence of knowledge. And as you close the manuscript and trace the annotations with your finger one last time, a lingering question arises. How many discoveries, insights, or practical innovations, medical, philosophical, or personal, survive only in these narrow margins, quietly shaping human understanding, and how many were irretrievably lost, leaving gaps in our perception of history? Reflection. Manuscript margins illustrate the hidden labor, observation, and quiet ingenuity that preserve knowledge across generations. Scribes transformed mundane repetition into subtle innovation, recording corrections, experiments, and personal reflections in narrow spaces that endure centuries. They remind us that human insight often persists in the smallest, least visible details, shaping understanding in ways both profound and invisible, and that history is as much written in the margins as in the main text. Story 10. Monastic kitchens, labor, preservation, and the hidden science of food. You step into the monastery's kitchen just as dawn light filters through narrow windows, illuminating the thick stone walls, hanging herbs, and worn wooden tables. The air is warm and heavy with the aroma of bread, porridge, and simmering broths. At first glance, it may seem like a simple place of cooking, but you quickly realize that survival, health, and the rhythm of monastic life depend on every detail of this space. Labor, observation, and careful technique here are not just culinary, they are acts of endurance and practical science. Monastic kitchens are structured with efficiency in mind. Large cauldrons sit over open hearths, while shelves are lined with dried herbs, grains, and preserved foods. Each item has a place. Each process follows a precise schedule. Meals are not prepared on impulse. They follow the rhythm dictated by bells and canonical hours. You notice that every action from fetching water to chopping vegetables is coordinated with timing, quantity, and order, reflecting an invisible discipline that underpins both sustenance and survival. Food preservation is a major concern. Fresh ingredients are seasonal, so monks rely heavily on drying, salting, pickling, and fermenting to ensure supplies last through winter. You might see vegetables sliced and layered with salt, meats cured over weeks, and grains carefully stored in airtight containers. Observation is key. Humidity, temperature, and even the quality of salt or smoke affect the longevity and safety of food. Survival depends on precise repetition, careful monitoring, and accumulated knowledge of preservation techniques. Labor in the kitchen is repetitive and physically demanding. Kneading bread, stirring cauldrons, chopping vegetables, and washing utensils are tasks performed daily, often for hours. Yet repetition teaches endurance and skill. You notice how long experience allows monks to gauge when bread dough is ready, when a broth has reached the perfect consistency, or when pickles have fermented sufficiently. Subtle observation, combined with repeated practice, transforms mundane labor into expertise that sustains the entire community. Herbs and spices are more than flavoring, they are medicine. Monks use culinary plants sage, thyme, garlic not only to enhance taste, but to prevent spoilage, aid digestion, and address minor illnesses. You observe how precise measurement, timing, and preparation affect both potency and flavor. The kitchen thus becomes a laboratory where food and health intersect, requiring vigilance, patience, and attention to detail. Hierarchy structures work here as elsewhere in the monastery. Senior cooks assign tasks, demonstrate techniques, and oversee preparation. Novices learn through observation and repetition, gradually internalizing the rhythms, skills, and subtleties of kitchen labor. You notice that even small errors, a poorly kneaded loaf, overcooked porridge, or improperly stored grain can ripple through the community, affecting both nourishment and morale. Survival relies on consistent execution and careful guidance. Daily routines are rigorous. Ingredients must be measured, water heated, fires maintained, and meals distributed on schedule. The kitchen hums with quiet activity, punctuated by the rhythm of tasks rather than conversation. You see how this repetition cultivates awareness, coordination, and endurance. Every loaf baked, every broth stirred, and every meal prepared contributes to the monastery's stability and health. Even mundane tasks carry subtle lessons in resourcefulness. Leftover scraps may be repurposed into broths or animal feed. Excess grains may be milled for flour or saved for future baking. You notice that sustainability is ingrained in both practice and mindset. Nothing is wasted, and each action reflects an understanding of cycles, timing, and conservation. The kitchen is a space where observation, experimentation, and endurance converge. Yet uncertainty persists. Fires may flare too hot, ingredients may spoil, or unexpected shortages may arise. Monks must adapt, applying experience and careful judgment to maintain both quantity and quality. You realize that the kitchen is a crucible not only of food, but of practical problem-solving, resilience, and the quiet accumulation of knowledge. And as you step back from the hearths and simmering pots, one question lingers. In a life structured by labor, repetition, and careful observation, how much practical knowledge about nutrition, preservation, and resourcefulness was quietly accumulated and transmitted across generations, and how much has been lost to time, decay, or simple neglect? By mid-morning, the monastery's kitchen is alive with coordinated motion. Novices knead dough while senior cooks monitor the simmering cauldrons, and others grind grains or chop vegetables for later meals. Every task follows a rhythm dictated by both bells and experience. You quickly notice that the kitchen is more than a place to cook, it is a living laboratory where observation, patience, and repeated labor shape survival, knowledge, and human resilience. Observation is critical. Monks carefully assess ingredients for quality, noting subtle differences in grain texture, color of vegetables, or firmness of roots. Even minor variations affect cooking time, preservation, and taste. You realize that the repeated attention to these details allows the monks to refine techniques over years. They develop an intuitive understanding of the interaction between ingredients, temperature, and timing, building practical knowledge that ensures both nourishment and health. The kitchen is also a space of quiet innovation. Monks experiment subtly, adjusting seasoning combinations, testing different cooking techniques, or refining preservation methods. You might notice a small change in the ratio of salt to vegetables for pickling, or the introduction of a new herb to a medicinal broth. These experiments are often iterative, repeated season after season, and transmitted quietly through observation and apprenticeship. Innovation here emerges slowly, through careful attention, endurance, and subtle trial and error. Labor is repetitive yet instructive. Kneading dough requires the right amount of pressure and timing. Stirring soups demands vigilance to prevent scorching. Chopping herbs must be done efficiently to preserve aroma and potency. Each repeated motion builds skill and strengthens endurance. You notice how repetition also enhances mindfulness. Monks develop an intimate familiarity with both materials and processes, making their labor both precise and adaptive. Hierarchy guides work and learning. Senior cooks supervise novices, demonstrating techniques, correcting errors, and sharing subtle tips passed down through decades. Mistakes are corrected with patience, and careful repetition ensures that knowledge is internalized rather than merely observed. You see that continuity of skill, endurance, and insight depends on this system of mentorship, allowing both labor and knowledge to persist across generations. Preservation is both science and practice. Salting, drying, smoking, and fermenting require precise timing, consistent observation, and meticulous technique. A slight lapse in temperature or moisture can ruin a batch of food. You notice how repeated experimentation allows monks to develop reliable preservation strategies, ensuring the community's survival through scarce winters and unpredictable harvests. The kitchen is thus a place where careful observation intersects with practical problem-solving and endurance. Even mundane tasks are opportunities for insight. Repurposing leftovers, rotating grains to prevent spoilage, or adjusting firewood usage for efficiency reflects an understanding of sustainability and resource management. These subtle innovations, though rarely recorded formally, are critical for long-term survival. You realize that much of the monastery's resilience stems from this quiet accumulation of practical knowledge over years of patient observation and repeated labor. The kitchen is also a space of discipline and endurance. Long hours, heavy lifting, and repetitive tasks test both physical stamina and mental focus. Monks must remain vigilant to avoid mistakes that could affect nutrition or safety. Yet the repetition cultivates resilience. Hands learn tasks through muscle memory, eyes detect subtle differences in ingredients, and minds develop patience and foresight. Life in the kitchen is both physically demanding and intellectually exacting. Despite this structure, uncertainty always looms. Poor harvests, spoilage, or unforeseen shortages require quick thinking and improvisation. Monks must adapt preservation methods, ration ingredients, and adjust meals to maintain both nourishment and morale. You notice that the ability to endure, observe carefully, and act thoughtfully under constraint is just as vital to survival as skill with knives, fires, or cauldrons. And as the sun moves across the sky and the kitchen settles into a brief lull before the next meal, one question lingers. In a life shaped by repetition, observation, and careful experimentation, how many practical innovations and lessons of endurance about food, preservation, and resourcefulness